Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The forest always feels different at night. By day, Yosemite is a breathtaking expanse of granite cliffs, towering sequoias, and roaring waterfalls. By night, it becomes a different beast altogether, something alive, pulsing with a quiet, primal energy. I've been a ranger here for 7 years. My name's Lucas Black, and my job is to ensure this park stays safe for both the people who come here and the wildlife that calls it home. In the summer, that means breaking up campfires that burn too late and chasing away the occasional bear sniffing around for unsecured food. In winter, it means helping stranded hikers find their way back before hypothermia sets in. It's not glamorous, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Yosemite is my cathedral, my solace. Until recently, it was the one place I felt truly at peace. That changed about 3 months ago. The first incident was easy to dismiss. A solo hiker didn't check out when expected. That's not uncommon. Hikers often underestimate how long a trail will take or lose track of time. A search and rescue team found his tent still standing at Little Yosemite Valley, his gear untouched. The assumption was that he fell while scrambling off trail. His body, if there was one, would show up sooner or later. But it didn't. The second incident was harder to ignore. A family of 3 didn't return from an overnight trip to Merced Lake. Their car sat abandoned at the trailhead for days. Again, we combed the backcountry. Again, we found nothing. Just their campsite, left in perfect order, with no sign of struggle or disturbance. People started to talk. Rumors spread among the rangers. Bears? Mountain lions? A particularly aggressive coyote pack? All possible, but the tracks we found, or didn't find, didn't add up. Animals leave signs. Paw prints, scat, fur. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving any of those. I didn't believe the whispers at first. A cryptid stalking Yosemite? It sounded like something out of a late-night History Channel special. But then there was the incident with the backpacker. His name was Alan Reyes, a regular visitor who knew the trails like the back of his hand. He showed up at the ranger station one morning, shaking and pale as a ghost. He claimed he'd been chased by something near Cloud's Rest. When we pressed him for details, he stammered out a story about a man with horns and fled before we could get more. I logged his report like any other, chalking it up to exhaustion or hallucination. But a part of me couldn't shake the way he looked at me, eyes wide with a fear that seemed too real to dismiss. Since then, I've started noticing things I hadn't before. Tracks in the mud that end abruptly, as if the creature making them simply vanished. A low, guttural sound at night that doesn't match any animal I've heard before. And worst of all, the growing sense that when I walk these woods, I'm not alone. Something is out there, and it's watching. The call came in just after dawn. A group of hikers had failed to return to their campsite near Tenaya Lake. They were scheduled for a 2-night stay, but their families reported no contact since they'd set out. When the camp host checked, their site was untouched. Tent and gear still there, car still parked at the trailhead. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I volunteered to lead the search. It wasn't unusual for hikers to get delayed or lost, but something about this one set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the pattern forming in the back of my mind, the growing list of unexplained absences that had been piling up over the past few months. Or maybe it was just that sinking gut feeling, the kind you learn to trust when you've spent as much time in the backcountry as I have. The morning was crisp and clear as I started up the trail. Tenaya Lake shimmered like glass under the rising sun, its surface perfectly still. The serenity felt wrong somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail to Cloud's Rest was well traveled, so finding the group shouldn't have been hard. But as I climbed higher, I noticed signs that made my skin crawl. Branches snapped at odd angles, gouges carved into tree trunks at chest height. No claw marks, though, which ruled out bears. I found a shoe, a single hiking boot, half buried in the dirt, laces still tied. No blood, no tracks leading away, just left behind. About 3 miles in, I found their campsite, or what was left of it. The clearing was eerily tidy, as if someone had meticulously erased any sign of human presence. The tent was zipped shut, food hung properly in bear canisters, but there was no trace of the hikers themselves. No clothes, no bags. It was as if they'd all simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. What struck me most were the tracks. At first glance, they looked like deer prints, but too large, too deep. The hoof marks wandered aimlessly through the campsite, then veered into the dense woods. I followed them for a while, but they led nowhere, vanishing abruptly in a patch of soft dirt that should have captured every step. I crouched to examine the spot, heart pounding. There was no logical explanation for tracks to simply stop. That's when I felt it, a presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill raced down my spine. The forest had gone utterly silent, no birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just the faint sound of my own breathing. Something was watching me. I could feel it. I scanned the trees, every shadow and movement twisting into shapes that weren't there. My hand hovered over the radio clipped to my belt, but I didn't call for backup. Not yet. There was no proof of danger, just a suffocating unease I couldn't shake. Then, from deep within the woods, I heard a noise. A low, guttural grunt. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. I froze, ears straining to catch the sound again. It hadn't been a bear's growl, nor the chuff of a mountain lion. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like the groan of a massive, injured animal, but with a cadence that felt unnervingly deliberate, like language stripped to its most primal form. The trees around me loomed impossibly large, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I tightened my grip on the flare gun strapped to my belt. Another sound. This time, closer. A crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, but heavier. Too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for a bear. My pulse hammered in my ears as I scanned the tree line, eyes darting between the dense undergrowth and the towering pines. Movement caught my attention, a shadow maybe 50 yards out flitted between the trees. Whatever it was tall, taller than any man, and unnaturally thin. Hello? My voice echoed, a feeble attempt at authority that was swallowed by the forest. I immediately regretted speaking. The shadow froze. For a moment I thought it was gone. Then it stepped out from behind a tree. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but that was where the similarities ended. Its frame was impossibly gaunt, limbs elongated and sinewy. Its skin, or what I assumed was skin, was a mottled gray-brown, blending seamlessly with the bark of the surrounding trees. But the most striking feature was its head. The skull of a goat, complete with curling horns, perched atop its thin neck like a grotesque mask. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My mind screamed at me to look away, to run, but my body betrayed me, locked in place by a terror I'd never felt before. The creature's head tilted, as if studying me. Its eyes, black voids that seemed to absorb the light around them, narrowed slightly. Then it did something that made my stomach churn. It smiled. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. The skin around its mouth, stretched taut and cracked, curled upward in an almost human expression of amusement. It took a step forward, and my paralysis broke. I stumbled back, fumbling for the flare gun. My hands shook as I raised it, finger on the trigger. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice cracked on the last word. The creature stopped, It tilted its head again, that grotesque grin still plastered across its face. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and bolted into the woods, moving with a speed and grace that no human or animal should possess. I didn't chase it. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay put, to listen. The forest was still deathly silent. No rustling leaves, no snapping branches to signal its retreat. It was just gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the flare gun until my knuckles turned white. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't natural. Something was very, very wrong in Yosemite. I returned to the ranger station shaken but determined to figure out what I'd seen. I didn't tell the others about the encounter, at least at first. What could I say? That I'd seen a creature with a goat's skull for a head stalking the woods? It would sound insane. Instead, I filed a brief report about the missing hikers, noting the unusual tracks and leaving out the rest. That night, I sat in the station's break room, my mind racing. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything that could explain the creature. After a few false starts, wild goat species, folklore about bears with deformities, I stumbled across something that sent a shiver down my spine. The legend of the goatman. It wasn't unique to Yosemite. Stories of a creature that was part human, part goat had been told across North America for decades, maybe centuries. In some versions, it was a failed government experiment, an escapee from a top-secret lab hidden deep in the woods. In others, it was an ancient spirit, a shapeshifter that preyed on the unwary. The details varied, but the core was always the same. The goatman was a predator, intelligent and cruel. It didn't just kill. It played with its victims, mimicking human voices to lure them deeper into the forest. Most of these stories came from Appalachia and the Midwest, places far from Yosemite. But as I read more, I began to notice similarities to recent incidents in the park. The disappearing hikers, the strange tracks, the eerie silence in the woods. Every detail matched the accounts. I was so engrossed that I didn't notice Mark, one of the veteran rangers, enter the room. "Burning the midnight oil, huh?" he said, startling me. I quickly minimized the browser tab. "Yeah, just reviewing some reports." Mark was a grizzled old-timer with decades of experience. If anyone had insights about Yosemite's darker side, it was him. I hesitated, then decided to test the waters. "Hey, Mark, have you ever heard of anything weird happening in the park? Like, really weird?" He raised an eyebrow. "Weird how? Like campers disappearing without a trace? Or people seeing things?" He studied me for a moment, then lowered his voice. "You've seen it, have you?" My heart skipped a beat. "Seen what?" "The goat man," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been working here 30 years. First time I heard about it was back in the 90s. A couple of hikers went missing near Glacier Point. Search and rescue team found their campsite, but no sign of them. Just tracks, hooves like a deer, but bigger, way bigger." My mouth went dry. "And you believe it?" Mark shrugged. "I didn't at first. But you spend enough time out there, you start noticing things. The silences, the tracks, people seeing shadows in the trees. It's always the same areas. Clouds Rest, Tenaya Lake, Merced Grove. If you're smart, you stay away." I leaned forward. "But what is it?" "No one knows," he said. "Could be some kind of animal we don't understand. Could be something else entirely, but whatever it is, it's dangerous, and if you've seen it, you need to be careful." Mark's words stayed with me long after he left. I couldn't shake the feeling that the goatman wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was hunting in Yosemite. Worse, I had a sinking suspicion that it wasn't done yet. The next disappearance came less than a week later. A solo camper had gone missing near Merced Grove. This time, the circumstances were even stranger. His permit indicated he'd been camping overnight in a remote spot, but when the search team arrived, they found his gear neatly packed away at the base of a sequoia. His tent was still in its bag, untouched as if he'd never set it up. The only trace of him was his boots, placed side by side in the dirt, pointing toward the trees. I volunteered for the search again, despite the warnings echoing in my mind from Mark. I couldn't sit back and let this thing keep picking people off. My gut told me this camper's disappearance was connected to the creature I'd seen, and I needed answers. Maybe more than that, I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. We set out at first light, a team of 5 rangers armed with the best equipment we had. GPS units, radios, and a few firearms we weren't technically supposed to carry. The mood was grim as we trudged through the towering sequoias. These trees were ancient, their massive trunks blotting out the sun and turning the forest floor into a shadowy maze. Normally, I found their presence comforting. Today they felt like silent sentinels watching our every move. 2 hours into the search, we found something that stopped us cold. A deer carcass, suspended high in the branches of a tree. Its body was torn open, entrails dangling like grotesque ornaments. Flies buzzed around the stench of rot, but there was no blood on the ground. No signs of a struggle. "Mountain lion?" one of the rangers suggested, though his voice wavered. "Mountain lions don't do this," Mark replied grimly. "They don't drag prey up trees like this. Not here." The team grew visibly uneasy, exchanging glances. I didn't say anything, but my mind was racing. The carcass wasn't just a kill, it was a message. We pressed on, following the faint trail of hoof-like prints that appeared intermittently in the dirt. They led us deeper into the grove, where the trees grew denser, their massive roots forming tangled networks beneath the soil. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and the familiar forest sounds faded, until the only noise was the crunch of our boots on the ground. That's when we found the clearing. It was a small circular patch of earth, devoid of vegetation, as if nothing dared to grow there. In the center stood a crude structure, a pile of branches and rocks arranged into something resembling an altar. Scattered around it were bones, both animal and human. Some were old, bleached white by time, others looked disturbingly fresh. One of the rangers swore under his breath, backing away. Mark knelt to examine the bones, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly. "Now." But before we could move, a sound echoed through the trees, a guttural choking noise halfway between a growl and a laugh. It came from the direction we'd just come, blocking our retreat. The team froze, weapons drawn, as the sound came again, closer this time. We weren't alone. And whatever was out there wasn't afraid of us. It was toying with us. The sound circled us, a guttural, almost mocking growl that echoed through the trees. My grip on the rifle tightened as I scanned the dense shadows. The others formed a loose defensive circle, their flashlights cutting through the dim light in sharp, desperate beams. "It's watching us," Mark muttered, his voice low but tense. "Stay close, and don't run. If you run, it'll come after you." No one questioned him. Even the most skeptical among us could feel it now. The oppressive weight of something intelligent and malicious observing us from just beyond the tree line. "Radio for backup," I said, keeping my voice steady. One of the rangers, Amy, reached for her radio, but before she could speak, the static erupted into ear-piercing feedback. She yanked it away from her ear, wincing. The sound cut off as abruptly as it started, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. "We're not going back the way we came," Mark said grimly. "He is cutting us off." "What do you mean it?" Amy hissed, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "What the hell is it, Mark?" Mark didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the shadows. "Keep moving. We'll circle around and head for the ridge. Stay together." We started walking, our steps slow and deliberate. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step. the towering sequoias casting long, skeletal shadows that danced in the flickering beams of our flashlights. The guttural growls had stopped, but the absence of sound was somehow worse. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The trail narrowed as we approached the ridge, the ground uneven and tangled with roots. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They were gouged deep into the bark of the trees lining the path. Long parallel scratches that didn't match any animal in the park. Fresh sap oozed from the wounds, glistening in the dim light. "What the hell is that?" one of the rangers whispered, pointing to a tree ahead. There, carved into the bark, was a symbol, a crude, spiraling shape that hurt to look at, like my eyes couldn't fully process it. I didn't know why, but it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Mark stopped, his face pale. That wasn't here before. We didn't have time to process his words. From somewhere ahead of us came a new sound, a deep, resonant thud, like heavy hooves striking the ground. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and getting closer. "Get your lights up," I barked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. We aimed our flashlights towards the sound, the beams converging on a shape emerging from the trees. It was there again, the thing I'd seen before. Its gaunt, elongated frame moved with an unnatural grace, its goat-like skull catching the light in sharp, angular flashes. But this time it didn't stay at a distance. It stepped forward into full view, and I finally saw its eyes. Or rather, the void where they should have been. Black, empty sockets that seemed to draw the light inward, making everything around it seem darker. Amy screamed, and in that moment the creature moved. It didn't charge. It didn't need to. Its sudden jerking motion was enough to send our carefully formed line into chaos. Someone fired a shot, Mark, I think, but the sound barely registered as we scattered, our instinct for survival overriding any semblance of strategy. I ran blindly into the woods, my flashlight swinging wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, the guttural growl rose again, louder this time, echoing off the trees like cruel laughter. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the forest fell silent once more. I stopped, panting, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I turned to look back, I realized I was alone. The forest around me felt like a tomb. The towering sequoias stood motionless, their thick trunks casting oppressive shadows that seemed to close in on me with every passing second. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the trees, desperate for any sign of the others. "Mark," I called out, my voice hoarse and strained. "Amy? Anyone?" No answer, just the suffocating silence. I checked my radio, but it was dead, the LED screen flickering weakly before going dark. My GPS, which had been working moments before, now refused to boot up. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed any connection to the outside world. I didn't want to move. Every instinct told me to stay put, to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible. But standing still in this silence was unbearable. So I picked a direction and started walking, keeping my steps slow and deliberate. Every crunch of leaves underfoot sounded deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first sign that I wasn't alone came when I spotted the tracks, the same hoof-like prints I'd seen before, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were staggered, almost bipedal, but too large and far apart to belong to anything I could explain. And they led directly in the direction I was heading. I stopped, considering turning back. But where would I go? I had no bearings, no working equipment, and no backup. Against my better judgment, I kept following the trail. The tracks led to a clearing, smaller than the last, but just as unsettling. In the center was another pile of rocks and branches, arranged in the same altar-like structure. But this one was different. Tied to the top with strips of torn fabric was something that made my stomach churn. It was a human figure, crudely constructed from sticks and bones, its head made from a shattered animal skull. Hanging from its arms were what I recognized as items from the missing camper's pack. a water bottle, a knife sheath, a bootlace. A sick, sinking feeling gripped me as I realized this was no accident. It was a warning. Trophies. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, raising my flashlight and rifle in unison. At first I saw nothing but trees. Then a shape emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint light. The creature was fully visible now, no longer hiding in the edges of my vision. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its skeletal frame wrapped in sinewy muscle that seemed to ripple unnaturally under its mottled, bark-like skin. The goat's skull atop its shoulders gleamed dully in the light, its curling horns framing a grotesque parody of a human face. Black void stared back at me where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head, the movement eerily human. Then it smiled. The skin around its mouth stretched and cracked, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth that seemed to pulse as though alive. I raised the rifle, aiming directly at its chest. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The creature didn't move. It just stood there watching me, its head tilting further as if in curiosity. And then it spoke. The voice was deep, resonant, and utterly wrong. It was a garbled mimicry of human speech, as if it were struggling to remember how to form words. Lost, it rasped, the sound grinding like stones in its throat. Lost. Alone. "What are you?" I demanded, though my voice shook with fear. The creature took a step closer, the ground trembling faintly under its weight. "Hunter," it said, the word dragging out into a guttural growl. And then it lunged. I fired my rifle, the bright light and heat searing through the darkness. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl. I fired more shots. The light illuminated its grotesque form for a split second, before it retreated into the shadows, its growls echoing through the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran, the forest closing in around me as the darkness swallowed me whole. My legs burned as I ran, weaving between the massive trunks of the sequoias. Branches lashed at my face, and my flashlight beam bounced wildly, casting erratic shadows that twisted the forest into a nightmare. Behind me, the guttural growls echoed, growing louder, closer. The creature wasn't just chasing me, it was herding me, driving me deeper into the woods. I stumbled over an exposed root and hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the wind from my lungs. My flashlight flew from my hand, skittering across the dirt and spinning to a stop. Its beam illuminated a grotesque sight, a fresh carcass, its rib cage splayed open, entrails arranged in a spiral pattern that made my stomach churn. The smell hit me seconds later, a sickly, sweet stench of death. The sound of heavy hooves striking the ground jolted me back to my senses. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the flashlight, shining it frantically into the darkness. The beam caught the glint of something inhuman, 2 massive horns rising from the shadows. The creature was there, standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching me. It didn't charge. It didn't need to. Instead, it moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting side to side as if studying me. It was playing with me, savoring my fear. The realization sent a cold wave of terror washing over me. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling. The creature tilted its head further, almost quizzically. Then, to my horror, it took another step forward, fully entering the beam of my flashlight. Its body was even more grotesque up close. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple, like bark peeling from a tree. The jagged edges of the goat's skull that formed its head glistened in the faint light, and its mouth stretched into that unnatural cracking smile. Then it spoke again. "Run," it said. The word stretched into a guttural rasp. The voice was wrong, too deep, too broken, as if it had learned the word by hearing humans scream it. I bolted, my survival instincts overriding my terror, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. Every path I took twisted back on itself. Every tree looked the same. I was running in circles, and the creature knew it. Its guttural growls followed me, rising and falling as if it were laughing. I burst into a small clearing and stopped short. In the center was another crude altar, this one larger and more intricate than the last. Bones, animal and human, were lashed together with strips of sinew, forming a grotesque spiral that radiated outward from a central pillar of stacked skulls. Blood, still fresh, dripped from the structure, pooling in the dirt below. I felt bile rise in my throat, but before I could turn away, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A human voice. "Help. Me." It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I scanned the clearing, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The voice came again, this time louder. "Help me." It sounded wrong. Office. Like someone was trying to mimic a human voice but didn't quite understand how. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the creature. It was mimicking human speech. Before I could react, the voice changed, morphing into something chillingly familiar. "Lucas," it said, using my name in a guttural rasp. "Run." It stepped into the clearing, its black void-like eyes fixed on me, and the chase began again. The clearing dissolved behind me as I sprinted into the forest, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. The creature's guttural calls echoed through the trees, closer than ever. It was no longer toying with me, it was hunting me in earnest. I stumbled into another patch of open ground and fell to my knees, gasping for air. My mind raced. I couldn't outrun it, that much was clear. My only option was to face it. If I was going to die in these woods, I wasn't going to die running. I was out of ammo, but my flashlight still worked. I scanned my surroundings, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. A jagged branch jutted from a fallen tree nearby, its broken end sharp enough to pierce. I grabbed it and steadied myself, forcing my breath to slow. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself were leaning in, waiting to see how this would end. The creature's silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, its towering form backlit by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. The goat's skull atop its shoulders gleamed, the hollow sockets of its eyes fixed on me. Its grotesque smile widened, splitting the skin of its face even further. "Lucas," it rasped, the sound distorted, mocking. "Run." I stood my ground, raising the branch like a spear. "Come on, then," I muttered, though my voice shook. "You want me? I'm right here." It paused, its head tilting again in that unnervingly human gesture. Then it charged. The ground shook under its massive weight as it closed the distance in seconds. I braced myself, aiming the branch at its chest. At the last second, I sidestepped and thrust the branch forward with all my strength. The jagged wood struck true, sinking into the creature's torso with a sickening crunch. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very trees around us. Black, viscous fluid poured from the wound, and for a moment I thought I'd actually hurt it. But then it grabbed the branch, its impossibly long fingers curling around the wood. It pulled it free with an almost casual motion, the wound already beginning to close. The black fluid sizzled as it hit the ground, releasing a foul, acrid stench. Panic surged through me as I realized the creature wasn't just strong. It was something far beyond human understanding. It couldn't be killed, at least not by any means I had. It lunged at me again, and I barely dodged, its claws grazing my shoulder. The pain was instant and searing, but I couldn't stop. I ran again. This time not in blind panic, but toward the only chance I had. I remembered the altars, the grotesque structures of bones and symbols. They weren't random. They meant something. If this thing had created them, then maybe they were the key to stopping it. I turned toward the spiral altar I'd seen earlier, its sickening shape burned into my memory. The creature followed, its guttural growls turning into something that almost sounded like laughter. It was enjoying this. When I reached the altar, I grabbed one of the human bones from the structure and swung it at the base of the spiral. The brittle connections shattered, and the entire structure collapsed into a heap. The creature screamed, a sound so loud and unnatural it felt like my eardrums might burst. It staggered, clutching its chest as if in pain, the black voids where its eyes should have been flared with something that might have been fear. I didn't stop. I tore into the altar, breaking it apart piece by piece. Each fragment I destroyed made the creature writhe and howl, its form flickering as though it were struggling to hold itself together. Finally, with one last blow, the central pillar of the altar crumbled. The creature let out a final, agonized roar and collapsed, its massive frame convulsing before disintegrating into ash. The black fluid evaporated, and the forest fell silent once more. I collapsed to the ground, every muscle in my body trembling. The air felt lighter, as though the oppressive weight that had hung over the forest was gone. But the memory of the creature's void-like eyes and mocking smile would haunt me forever. I had survived, but I knew deep down this wasn't the end. Creatures like this didn't simply vanish. They waited. And when the time was right, they hunted again. By the time I stumbled back to the ranger station, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The forest felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. But I knew better than to let my guard down. The creature might be gone, but its presence lingered, etched into every shadow, every twisted branch. Mark and the others were waiting for me, their faces lit with relief when they saw me. But the unspoken question hung in the air. Where were the others? They didn't make it, I said hoarsely, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's face darkened, his weathered features tightening with grim understanding. He didn't press for details, and for that I was grateful. He'd seen enough in his years here to know when to let a man keep his horrors to himself. I filed my report later that day, sticking to the bare bones of the story. A freak accident, an unexplained disappearance, nature's chaos claiming more lives. The official explanation would be enough to satisfy the higher-ups and keep the public from panicking. But the truth, what I'd seen, what I'd fought, stayed with me, a secret I carried like a scar. Weeks passed, and the disappearances stopped. The forest returned to its usual rhythms, its trails filled once again with the laughter of hikers and the quiet murmurs of campers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only temporary, that the creature, whatever it was, wasn't truly gone, just dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I found myself avoiding the deeper parts of the park, the places where the trees grew tallest and the shadows stretched longest. I couldn't bring myself to patrol those areas alone anymore. And though I never saw the creature again, I sometimes heard it in the whisper of wind through the branches, in the distant crack of a twig at dusk. The park had changed for me. What had once been my sanctuary now felt like a battleground, a place where something ancient and malevolent still lurked in the spaces between the trees. I stayed on the job, but I knew I'd never see Yosemite the same way again. One night, as I sat alone in the ranger station, staring at the map of the park spread across my desk, the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a sound emerged. A low, guttural rasp that sent a chill down my spine. A voice whispered, "Run." I came to the Appalachian Trail with every intention of following the rules. That's what the park ranger had told me. Stay on the marked paths, don't hike after sundown, and no matter what, don't wander into areas without blaze marks. He had spoken as if these instructions were etched into the rock of the mountains themselves. I nodded, smiled, and assured him I would be careful. Yet, as so often happens, curiosity and the allure of solitude overcame caution. It began simply enough. I was supposed to stick to the safe loop that offered a scenic overlook, commonly visited by families and day hikers, clearly indicated on my map. But I had heard rumors from a friend, old stories about a hidden clearing with a dawn view so stunning you'd weep at its beauty. She had claimed it was just beyond the maintained trails, through a stretch of old-growth forest that no one bothered to log and few dared to enter. She hadn't gone there herself, she'd only heard. That should have been warning enough, but I was taken by the romantic vision of it, sunlight cascading over distant blue ridges, a sight worthy of breaking a few rules, or so I naively thought. The morning I set out, the trail was reassuringly ordinary. Bright trailblazes led me over gentle ascents, across small wooden bridges, and under broad canopies of oak and hickory. Within a few hours, I reached the expected scenic overlook, the one everyone knew. It was nice, but hardly the life-changing panorama I'd imagined. I could see a faint shimmer of towns far off, and the rolling ridges were pleasant, nothing more. That was when I decided to push further. With a quick glance over my shoulder to ensure nobody followed, I stepped off the main trail. It felt transgressive, but not exactly dangerous. At first it was easy enough. The understory was fairly open, and I thought I would just explore a short distance. Soon I spotted a faint footpath, maybe from deer or old hunters. I followed it, telling myself I'd turn back in an hour, just a quick adventure. As I pressed deeper, I noticed subtle changes. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser. My GPS watch lost signal. I found odd scorch marks on a trunk. I spotted a bundle of sticks intricately woven into a shape, some kind of sign I didn't understand. Still I continued. My stomach knotted when I realized I hadn't seen a blaze mark or any human sign for miles. The quiet deepened, no distant chatter of hikers, no cheerful rustle of the known trail. But I pressed on, confident I could navigate back. It was then I noticed how quiet the birds had grown. I paused, scanning the landscape. The canopy overhead dappled the ground in shifting light. A breeze stirred leaves. The forest seemed ordinary at a glance. But something was off, as if I were an intruder in a place that did not want me. And I was. I kept forging ahead, expecting to stumble upon that rumored clearing at any moment. The terrain was steeper now, and the further I went, the more it felt as though I were leaving something behind. Some fragile safety tethered to the known trails. I tried to quell my unease. My pack was full of supplies. I knew basic wilderness survival. If all else failed, I could retrace my steps. Still, each passing minute brought a mounting tension I couldn't quite name. In the late afternoon light, I came across a strange pattern in the moss. It looked as if someone had pressed a large hoof into the ground, compressing the greenery into a neat oval. Larger than any deer print I'd ever seen, and cleaner too. It had no accompanying rear prints, just a single, impossible mark. I stared at it for too long, my heart picking up pace. The forest gave nothing away, standing silent and indifferent. Trying to dismiss the print as some quirk of soil and windfall, I moved on. Eventually I found what might have once been a human track. A small cairn of stones arranged along a subtle ridge, old and half-tumbled. This encouraged me. Maybe others had passed this way. Maybe that rumored clearing was real. The thought that I was treading a path few dared to follow made me feel both proud and uneasy. As the hours passed, the sun began to slide down the sky. The forest canopy thickened, admitting only narrow bands of light. I realized I should set up camp soon. I didn't like the idea of pushing through this unknown land in darkness. Already my mind conjured images of losing my footing or stumbling into a ravine. I would find a flat spot, pitch my tent, and give myself the comfort of at least one solid night's rest before attempting to find my way back at first light. I found a decent site, a gentle slope beneath twisted oaks, with some dry leaves suitable for clearing out a sleeping spot. Unrolling my tent, I listened for the calls of distant wildlife. At home, I relished the hum of crickets and the croak of frogs near my backyard. Here, the silence was too profound. My stove's hiss as I heated water for my freeze-dried meal sounded embarrassingly loud, as if announcing my presence to everything lurking behind those dark trunks. As dusk settled, my small LED lantern offered a meager circle of comfort. I tried to imagine how the clearing would look at sunrise, warm light on endless ridges. But that hopeful image kept slipping away, replaced by flickering fears. I wondered if anyone had truly stood where I was now. As I crawled into my tent, I caught the faint scent of something like old fur or decaying leaves drifting on the breeze. I tried not to think about the impossible hoof mark and told myself I'd sleep well enough. But sleep did not come easily. I woke before dawn, feeling worse than when I'd laid down. My sleep was restless, broken by fragments of uneasy dreams in which the trees bent in impossible angles, and something tall and silent watched me with eyes that never blinked. The absence of familiar night noises left me shaken. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crawling out of the tent, I noticed the forest's gloom had deepened overnight. The morning should have brought chorus birds and a gentle blue light. Instead, the woods hovered in a stale twilight. I checked my bearings. The compass spun sluggishly, and my GPS watch refused to regain signal. The air was heavier, saturated with the scent of wet decay and something else, something almost sweet, like sap left to rot. I decided to move, to try to find the main trail again. Perhaps I'd overshot, veered too far in one direction. Surely with some persistence I could backtrack. Packing up my camp with hurried, clumsy hands, I noticed my food bag had been torn at the corner. It wasn't shredded as if by claws, but as though something had carefully nibbled it open. The tear was neat, the hole just large enough to remove a packet. One of my freeze-dried meals was gone. I shrugged it off as a raccoon or a squirrel. Yet the way that hole had been made, so precise, gnawed at my mind. I started walking uphill. I figured that gaining elevation might allow me to see beyond the canopy. Maybe I could spot a ridge or some landmark. The forest floor was treacherous, littered with ankle-breaking roots. Mossy stones rolled underfoot. Soon I had to push through a thicket of tangled shrubs. Beyond them, I found a small clearing with a leaning stump in its center. At first glance, it looked empty and ordinary, but as I approached, I saw something lodged into the stump's ragged top, a single deer antler weathered and dark, its tines sharpened by some unnatural hand. I should have left it alone, but curiosity overcame good sense. I inched closer, reaching out, but as I touched the antler, I felt a chill run up my arm. The surface was cold and oddly slick, and when I pulled my hand away, my fingertips smelled of rancid fat. Backing away, I realized that this was no fallen antler. It looked placed there, a marker, a warning. With mounting dread, I scanned the perimeter of the clearing. Deep in the dim underbrush, something shifted. Not the clumsy movement of a bear or boar, but a subtle withdrawing, as if a tall shape had just stepped behind a trunk. I couldn't see it directly, but I felt its presence as surely as I felt the ground beneath my boots. My heart started to pound. I'd broken the rules and trespassed into a place I didn't understand. I turned and ran, hoping that movement would blot out fear, that speed would lead me back to safety. It didn't. I forced myself onward, though I didn't have a true direction. Every step made me realize how isolated I was. My lungs burned as I navigated a steep downgrade, and I nearly slipped on a carpet of wet leaves that reeked faintly of carrion. The forest was rearranging itself, or so it seemed. Paths I thought I recognized led me into thickets of thorns. Gullies appeared where I remembered none. It was as though the land itself resisted my escape. I began to notice an unsettling pattern. Scat and fur tufts at irregular intervals, arranged like breadcrumbs. Some were animal droppings. Some were what looked like half-digested plant matter. I saw rough gouges on bark, carved at shoulder height, far too high for any ordinary deer. It left me breathless, not just from exertion, but from a deepening sense that something, some cunning presence, was guiding me along a route of its choosing. A branch snapped behind me. I whirled, but found only swaying ferns and a blur of twisted trunk. Nothing obvious followed, but that absence felt too deliberate. My mind began to conjure shapes where there were none, tall silhouettes blending seamlessly into mossy bark, antlers disguised as bare branches. Each time I blinked, I half expected to see something step forward, but it never did, not fully. It wanted me uneasy, off balance. As daylight faded again, I tried to steel myself. I'd ignored the rules. I had no one to blame but myself. Now I needed a plan. Find water, set a camp, build a fire, try to navigate by the stars if I could. And yet the thought of lingering in one place chilled my blood. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. But where? Stumbling into a small ravine, I slid down loose soil until I stood in a shallow creek. The water was cold and tasted like iron. I knelt and filled my bottle, listening. The forest was so quiet I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. The silence had a texture, as if something large held its breath just out of sight. That was when I glimpsed it, only for a moment. On the opposite bank, not 20 feet away, stood a figure. At first I thought it was a large buck, tall, broad-antlered, its body lean and powerful. But then it shifted, and I realized something was wrong with its shape. Its torso seemed elongated, limbs bent at uncomfortable angles, and its eyes, reflecting the dim twilight, were not the vacant stare of a deer. There was an intent there, an intelligence. I froze, not daring to blink. The creature stood impossibly still. If it had been natural, it would have fled at my presence, or at least stomped and huffed. But this thing only watched. Slowly it lowered its head, almost like a nod. Terror seized me. Before I knew it, I was climbing out of the ravine, scrambling up muddy slopes, leaving the creek behind. I didn't look back. I forced myself to slow down, to stop sprinting blindly. My chest burned and my legs wobbled. If I kept blundering ahead, I'd injure myself, then I'd be done for. I needed clarity, a strategy. The creature, whatever it was, had followed quietly, never rushing, never making a grand display. It simply existed at the edges of my perception. No matter how fast or how far I ran, it would be there, waiting, guiding me deeper into some unknown trap. I found a low rise of rock and climbed it, hoping to gain some vantage. The forest canopy was thick, making it hard to see more than a few yards in any direction. But from the rock's crest, I spotted something unusual. A sunken depression in the hillside where ferns grew in odd patterns, and a dead tree lay partially collapsed into a hollow. Hunger gnawed at my belly. I'd lost one meal to that careful nibble in the night, and my stomach clenched with worry. Yet I dared not linger too long. Still, I needed clues. Anything to help me understand what I was dealing with. Perhaps that hollow concealed something. Against my better judgment, I descended toward it. Inside the hollow, the smell hit me first, a stale animal musk tinged with an acrid bite. The space was cramped, the dead tree trunk forming a makeshift roof. I saw a cluster of objects. At first I took them for random debris. Sticks, strips of bark, and a piece of old cloth. As I knelt closer, I realized it was a shredded backpack, weather-beaten and half-buried in moldy leaves, part of a frame pack with snapped straps and rusted buckles. The cloth was a torn jacket sleeve. Among them lay a water bottle, cracked wide, and a camera smashed to shards of plastic and glass. This was someone's gear, someone who came here before me, someone who broke the rules. Now their belongings lay discarded like mulch. My throat tightened. I had to turn over a piece of cloth to be sure, but as I did, I found a twisted piece of animal sinew tied into a knot. It was arranged too deliberately to be random forest litter. Nearby, etched into the bark of the fallen trunk, I spotted lines, desperate and ragged. They formed words, though distorted by fungus and time. Don't run, it wants you to run. I pulled back, stumbling over my feet. A sudden understanding swept through me, a realization that the creature was not some mindless predator. It was patient. It enjoyed this. The chase, the fear, it was all part of its design. I stood, heart racing, and noticed a faint marking on a nearby tree. A few carved scratches in a pattern I couldn't decipher. Perhaps a sign from whoever tried and failed before me. They had tried to leave warnings where they could. I backed out of that hollow and looked around. The forest seemed to tighten, an arena for a deadly game I had already lost sight of how to escape. I moved through the forest with careful steps, trying to remember the ranger's advice, trying to recall any folklore I'd ever heard about creatures like this. A Wendigo, I thought, though I knew little more than the name and a vague sense of dread it conjured. The thing wasn't simply a buck or a sick animal. It stood on that boundary between what I could understand and what I feared. Deer-like but not deer, man-like but not man. I knew I had to keep my wits about me. The sun would be setting again soon, another helpless night if I didn't find a way out. I tried to think. The Appalachian Trail wasn't endless. I couldn't be that far from civilization. If I just kept moving in one consistent direction, I'd eventually break free from this dense wilderness. But the forest didn't feel like normal land anymore. It was as if the rules of navigation were suspended within these trees. I forced myself to pick a direction. East, I decided, judging by the slope of the ground and the dim quality of light. East should lead me downhill, toward valleys where streams and paths might exist. My pace was steady, every sense alert. The undergrowth snagged at my pants, leaves brushed my face, and occasionally I heard branches creak overhead. I told myself it was normal forest noise, yet something about those sounds was too deliberate, too measured. I found a trickle of water and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a larger stream. Water often guides travelers out of unknown terrain. Kneeling, I drank carefully and looked for tracks. I found faint impressions that might have been hooves, but they didn't behave like normal deer prints. They circled the stream in loops and meanders, as if toying with me. I thought of the warning scratched into the bark, "Don't run." Maybe that was key. The creature wanted panic. It wanted me to rush, to stumble into exhaustion, to lose myself entirely. If it was playing a game, denying it that pleasure might be my only weapon. So I forced myself to proceed calmly, to stop every so often and rest, to pretend I had all the time in the world. But my mind wouldn't stop churning. I recalled stories of hikers gone missing, never found, their names etched into worn memorial plaques at trailheads. Had they broken the rules too? Were their remains scattered like the old gear I had found, trophies for this beast? Late in the day, I spotted something that made my heart leap, a faint blaze of paint on a tree trunk, white and chipped, but unmistakable, a trail marker. Relief surged in me. I'd found a real sign of human paths. If I followed it, maybe I'd come out onto a known route. My shoulders shook with near hysterical laughter. I stepped closer, hand outstretched as if touching the paint could bring me home. Then I saw it, just beyond the painted tree, standing so still it blended with the boles and brush, the antlered shape. It cocked its head. It had led me here. It stood in the twilight, its presence a perfect perversion of a graceful deer. Its antlers stretched wide, not symmetrical but gnarled and twisting. Its eyes fixed on me with a calm, unnerving intelligence. Now close enough to truly see, I noticed how its forelimbs were longer than a deer's should be, how it stood almost upright in a slouching posture. Patches of fur were missing, exposing pale, sinewy flesh beneath. The scent that drifted toward me reminded me of old blood and damp stone. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My instinct screamed at me to run, but the warning I'd found echoed in my mind. Don't run. I forced myself to stand firm. My chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and I realized tears were blurring my vision. I tried to speak, but no words came. What would I say? Please let me go? It had no reason to show mercy. The creature tilted its head slowly, as if examining me from a new angle. Its breathing was nearly silent, but I sensed it was amused. Then, with a smooth, unnatural motion, it lowered itself and disappeared behind a screen of ferns. Gone as if it had never existed. My whole body shook. I wanted to take a single step forward, to reach that painted blaze, to confirm I was near something human, but fear pinned me in place. If it wanted me off balance, it had succeeded. Perhaps it was testing how I'd behave. Did it crave a chase in the dark, or did it prefer to stalk me slowly until I collapsed? I needed to regain control. I breathed deeply and thought, if I'm being manipulated, I must break the pattern. It wanted me here at this painted blaze, tantalizingly close to a known trail. That meant I should do something unexpected. I stepped back, away from the blaze. I could sense its presence out there, watching. Instead of following the trail, I edged around to a different line of trees, forcing myself to move calmly, steadily, without panic. I didn't have a weapon except my small knife. Against this thing, that was laughable. All I had was my will not to give it the reaction it desired. As I walked, the forest around me began to shift again. Roots snagged at my boots, branches tangled in my hair. My pack caught on rough bark. Each time I tugged free, I expected to hear a sudden rush of movement behind me. But no, it maintained its eerie silence. Dusk deepened. I forced myself to stop and build a crude shelter, a lean-to of fallen branches and leaves. I gathered some stones and dry wood to start a fire with my lighter. It took me several tries, my hands shaking, but soon a small flame danced before me. The light was weak, but it carved a fragile island of safety in the dark. I curled around the fire, knife in hand, and waited. I would not run. I would survive this, somehow. I woke from a half-sleep just before dawn. The fire had dwindled to embers. I dozed in and out all night, every creak of wood and brush jolting me awake. Nothing attacked, but I felt the creature's presence weaving through the darkness, just beyond my vision. It was testing my resolve, shaping my terror. Even sleep offered no respite. I dreamt in flashes, antlers and hollow eyes, twisted trails and old warnings. With trembling hands, I coaxed the fire back to life, a small victory against the clinging chill. My stomach rumbled loudly, but I had only a few scraps left. I forced them down mechanically. Hunger weakened me, but I had no choice except to keep moving. I couldn't just wait here. I needed human voices. A friendly camp, a ranger station, anything that signaled I had returned to the world I knew. The forest around me gave no hints, only silence and tangled shadows. Rising stiffly, I resolved to move onward. I wouldn't let myself become prey. I started downhill, trying to maintain a purposeful stride, even as my mind screamed at me to glance over my shoulder. My legs ached, my back throbbed, and the cuts from thorns stung with sweat. Still, I pressed on. The land began to change again, the foliage thinning slightly, allowing more daylight to trickle in. Perhaps I was emerging on the far side of this nightmare forest. Then I saw a movement, real, definite movement, through a gap in the trees. Two figures walking slowly, talking softly. They seemed human, bundled in layered clothing. I nearly cried out in relief. Other hikers, or maybe local hunters. I stumbled forward, eager to close the distance. But just as I was about to shout, I hesitated. The creature was cunning. Could this be a trick? I hid behind a thick trunk and watched carefully. The pair carried bows across their backs, and one had a necklace of feathers. They were scanning the forest floor as if tracking something. They spoke in low, serious voices I couldn't quite make out. Slowly I stepped forward, calling softly. "Hello?" My voice cracked, and for a terrifying second I wondered if I'd draw the Wendigo to us all. They whirled, startled. I raised my hands, showing I meant no harm. To my immense relief, they did not vanish like illusions. They regarded me with wary eyes. The older one, his hair braided, face weathered, asked quietly, "How did you get here?" His accent was soft but firm, and his gaze flicked into the woods as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. I tried to explain, words tumbling out. I told them I'd strayed off trail, that something was following me. I caught the exchange of concerned glances between them. The younger one nodded solemnly. I sensed they knew more than I did about what stalked these woods. They motioned me forward, hushed me to silence, and beckoned me to follow. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could survive this. Maybe I wasn't alone anymore. The two men led me through a part of the forest that felt different. The trees were still old and looming, but they stood a bit farther apart, allowing slivers of sunlight to reach us. As we walked, I noticed they moved quietly, as if aware that noise was dangerous. They took turns scanning behind us and above, as though the threat could drop from a branch or slip through the underbrush at any moment. I followed with a mixture of relief and dread, unsure what would happen if we were confronted. After a while, the older man finally broke the silence. "We've seen its signs," he said quietly, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "You broke the rules. It knows this land. It's older than the new trees, older than the stone paths. The younger man glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "It's waiting for you to panic," he added. "That is how it feeds, on fear, on the collapse of hope." I shuddered. These two knew exactly what hunted me and how it operated. "A Wendigo?" I asked, voice trembling. The older man gave a slow nod. "This one takes the shape of what you might trust, a deer, a gentle creature of the woods, but twisted. It's old and clever. It learned to lure hikers who think themselves too clever for the rules. Can you help me?" My voice cracked at the question, a child's plea. I had never felt so helpless. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he raised a hand and brought us to a halt. We stood near an old tree with ribbon-like strips of bark peeled away. He pressed a hand to the trunk, closed his eyes, and listened. After a moment, he spoke softly. "We can try, but it's stubborn. It won't let you go easily." The younger man handed me a small pouch. Inside, I found a mix of crushed leaves, some kind of aromatic resin. "Keep this near you," he said. "It masks certain scents. With luck, it might confuse it. Buy us time." They looked at each other, as if deciding something silently. Then the older man gave a slight nod. They explained that we must head to higher ground and then cut across a ridge. From there, a known path led to a place where local tribes once camped in the old days, grounds that the Wendigo found less hospitable. "It can still follow," the younger one warned, "but it will be weakened, uncertain." Every step we took from that point on felt like a test. The creature tried to hurt us. I could sense it. Occasionally, we'd hear the snap of a twig far too close or spot a scrape on bark that hadn't been there a moment before. But we resisted the urge to run. The men guided me steadily, forcing a calm I didn't know I had in me. We climbed, the slope growing steeper, the ground rockier. The trees thinned. The day wore on. I dared to hope. If I could reach that old campsite, maybe I could truly escape. We reached the ridge by late afternoon. The wind was stronger here, pushing against us, carrying scents away. I could see beyond the forest canopy now, the rolling green ridges of the Appalachians stretching off into a hazy distance. Somewhere out there lay the real world, with roads and people who never imagined what lurked deep among these ancient trees. The two men scanned the horizon. "Not far now," the younger said. He pointed toward a faint trail worn into the stony ground. "Stay with us, and no matter what you see, do not run." We started along that trail. With each step, I felt the forest's hold weaken. The air smelled cleaner, less stagnated by decay. For the first time since I'd gone off trail, I heard distant bird calls. It gave me courage. I focused on my breathing, on the solid feel of earth beneath my boots. Then it struck. A shape darted into view ahead, blocking the narrow path. Antlers, lean shoulders, that horrific blend of deer and hunger. The Wendigo towered over us, its eyes gleaming with old malice. Closer now, I saw how it moved almost fluidly, its limbs bending in ways that defied understanding. The two men stepped forward, but they did not shoot. Instead, they muttered something low, a string of words I couldn't understand. Their presence seemed to confuse it. The creature pawed at the ground, flicked its ears. A low rasping sound came from its throat. It tried to circle, but we held firm. We did not flee. I pressed the pouch of crushed leaves and resin to my chest, praying silently. The creature's head lowered, and for a moment I feared it would charge. But something in the men's stance, their calm persistence, held it at bay. They took slow steps forward, pushing it to retreat. Without sudden moves, we guided it off the path, stepping aside to reclaim a route to safety. It paced along the edge of the ridge, fuming silently. I saw the muscles ripple under its patchy fur, but the men ushered me onward, never turning their backs to it. With each step forward, the Wendigo's shape seemed more uncertain, as if it were fading into the tree line, losing its grip on me now that I was out of its chosen territory. Soon the creature slipped behind a trunk and did not reappear. When we reached a cluster of old fire pits and piles of ancient stones that might have been hearths once, the older man finally spoke. "You're safe enough here. We'll get you to the main trail." I slumped to the ground, shaking, tears of relief streaming down my face. They knelt beside me, offering water and quiet comfort. "We'll guide you back," the younger one said gently. "Next time, follow the rules." In the days that followed, they led me through familiar trails, eventually delivering me to a ranger station. From there, I returned home. I survived, but I carried the memory with me, the knowledge that the wild places are older and deeper than we imagine, and that some rules are written in silence, enforced by things we cannot fully name. He had been hunting for the better part of a week, moving through dense evergreen groves and rocky passes that offered no kindness. He was seasoned at this. He'd tracked elk through autumn mists and brought down boar that charged in blind panic. Usually he prided himself on meticulous planning, studying the terrain, the weather patterns, and potential exit routes. But even the best preparation can unravel when nature decides to close its fist. That morning the snow had been a gentle hush, sifting over his shoulders as he packed his last campsite. By midday, it had transformed into a relentless onslaught of white chaos, swallowing trails and landmarks, throwing illusions before his eyes. He pressed on, rifle slung over his shoulder and sidearm strapped firmly to his hip, trying to follow his compass north. But the wind howled so fiercely he couldn't be sure which direction was forward anymore. Each step sank him deeper into drifts that reached nearly to his waist. The cold stung at the gap of skin between glove and sleeve, finding every weak point in his layered clothes. As dusk advanced, the storm intensified. He knew staying outside was suicide. His body would freeze, and he'd become another frozen shape beneath the ever-accumulating snow. Scanning desperately for shelter, he glimpsed a shape among the trees, a structure that did not belong to this wild place. The outline emerged from the blizzard as he drew closer, a small cabin with a steep old roof and shuttered window. It looked abandoned, the surrounding snow undisturbed by recent footsteps, no smoke rising from the crooked chimney. He contemplated passing it by, a hunter's wary instinct telling him to avoid unknown shelters. Yet the wind's roar made the decision for him. He pushed the swollen wooden door open with a shoulder and stepped into the dark interior. Inside, the air was stale and bitter cold, but it offered respite from the screaming storm. With a grumble, he set down his pack and pulled the door shut, latching it with a rough twist of an iron handle. The place was barely furnished, a low cot against one wall, a small table and a single chair, and a stove in the corner coated in old ash and rust. The plank floor creaked softly beneath his boots as he tested his footing. He lit a match and used it to coax flame into a small kerosene lamp he carried. Its weak glow revealed a room of stagnant shadows, corners that refused to give up their secrets. He reached into his pack for tinder, feeding the stove until a tentative warmth spread into the space. His breath slowed. He was safe for the moment, at least from the storm. But something about this place, the silence felt palpable, not serene as expected, but guarded. He couldn't place it yet, but a primal tension hummed in the stillness. He sat down, rifle within arm's reach, and waited, wondering what the night would bring. He moved slowly, letting his eyes adjust as the kerosene lamp's light flickered along the rough timbers. The cabin was small, yet his sense of unease expanded like a second presence. He ran a gloved hand along the grain of a beam, feeling old splinters prick at the leather. A ragged rug covered part of the floor near the cot, threads worn so thin he could see dusty boards beneath. He noticed scratch marks on the wall by the window, parallel grooves that didn't resemble blade work and weren't made by any clean tool. They looked more like the work of desperate fingernails, though spaced too widely for human hands. Approaching the window, he scraped away frost with the edge of his hunting knife. Outside, night smothered the forest. The storm's fury had not waned. Ribbons of snow slashed at the pane, and what little moonlight there was revealed only swirling white chaos. He pressed his ear against the glass, listening, expecting the muffled thud of shifting snowbanks or the restless creak of ice-laden pines. Instead, he heard nothing, no wind, no distant crack of a branch, no animal cry. The storm raged silently in his ears as if filtered out by the cabin's old timbers. That silence unsettled him more than any howl might have. He turned back to the interior. A lump formed in his stomach as his lamp illuminated odd details. On the ceiling beams he saw old hooks driven into the wood at irregular intervals, some empty, one still holding a length of twisted rope. On the floor near the stove, a pile of old ashes seemed to include fragments of bone. He knelt and moved the ashes gently with the tip of his knife. Tiny shards, porous, off-white, could have been animal remains, perhaps from small game. Yet their shape was strange, almost malformed. He decided he needed to secure his temporary refuge. He hauled the chair in front of the door, angling it under the latch for extra reinforcement. He checked his rifle, a reliable bolt-action piece that had saved him countless times. Beside it, his sidearm fully loaded and ready. It gave him some measure of confidence. He had no intention of cowering here all night, but with the storm outside, he had little choice. He examined the stove more closely. The chimney above rattled faintly as if something were trapped in the flue. Carefully, he opened the stove's iron mouth and peered up. Empty darkness and a hint of soot. Whatever rattled might just be the wind, yet he could not shake the impression that it mimicked movement, a subtle rocking that suggested something alive. He closed it firmly, adding a few more twigs to keep the fire going. As he settled down on the cot, a smell reached his nostrils. Not the acrid scent of burned wood, but something faintly metallic. He sniffed the air again. The smell lingered, then retreated, leaving him in a silence that felt suddenly too perfect. He tried to rest, but true sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he propped himself in a half-sitting position on the cot, rifle balanced across his knees, sidearm holstered tight at his hip, and the lamp turned low. His breath misted faintly in the dimness. Outside, the storm still battered against the world, but in here the silence stretched, taut as a snare wire. Just as he felt his eyelids grow heavy, a dull impact shuddered through the walls. He jolted upright. It didn't come from the door or the window, more like something had fallen or collided with the outer corner of the cabin. He stood quietly, ears straining. The quiet returned, heavy as the snowdrifts. He considered calling out, then decided against it. Whatever was out there, if anything, did not deserve a greeting. Time stretched. He paced slowly, careful not to let his boots thump on the plank floor. Periodically, he checked outside again, though it was useless. The window only showed swirling whiteness. Eventually, he crouched beside it and cleared a new patch of frost. The wind was strong enough to lift the top layer of snow, creating a veil over the scene. He scanned what little he could see. Dark silhouettes of trees bent under their burden, lumps of drifted snow piled at odd angles. Then a subtle movement caught his eye, just at the far limit of vision. A shape shifted among the pines, tall and lean, then vanished behind a trunk. He stiffened. Moose? A starving elk? This region was known for wolves, but they rarely stood upright like that. He rubbed the glass with his sleeve, trying for a clearer view, but by the time he looked back, it was gone. He considered opening the door a crack, firing a shot into the air to scare off whatever it might be. But firing blindly into a raging storm felt reckless. If there was more than one creature lurking, he'd only give them his position, though they probably knew it already. He stepped away from the window and lit another lamp he'd found on a shelf, giving himself more light. Nothing stirred inside the cabin. His traps, simple tripwires he had set at the door and near the stove, remained intact. He knelt and touched the floorboards. They were surprisingly cold. In fact, the warmth from the stove didn't seem to spread the way it should. It felt contained, as if the cabin were swallowing it. He opened the door just a hand's width and peered out, ready to slam it shut. Instead of the expected roar of wind, the night greeted him with a strange hush. Snow hissed silently across the threshold, swirling into miniature dunes against his boots. He scanned left and right. Nothing moved. Before he closed the door, he sensed, not saw, something withdrawing into the blackness between trees. He felt its regard like a weight on his chest. He bolted the door again, heart thudding, and resolved to remain vigilant until dawn. At first light, the storm's fury diminished into a steady snowfall that allowed him at least some visibility. He felt relief at seeing dawn's dull glow through the iced-over window, though it revealed no comfort. The landscape outside was utterly transformed. Where last night had been only a shapeless mass of white and dark timber, now there were patterns carved into the snow. Long, irregular footprints circled the cabin, widely spaced as if made by something that took impossibly long strides. Each print was a shallow depression rimmed with ice crystals, and within them he could discern strange markings, like overlapping crescents. The hunter was not a superstitious man. He knew tracks, how to read their depth, their spacing, the weight and gait of the animal. But these did not match anything he'd encountered. They weren't the paw prints of wolves, nor the cloven hooves of deer or elk. They weren't even human, at least not as he understood it. He stood at the cabin's threshold, rifle ready, scanning the perimeter. No sign of the creature that made them, only the quiet hiss of wind sliding through the pines. He ventured a few yards out, careful to keep the cabin in sight. Snow crunched under his boots, masking any subtle sounds. He followed the tracks for a short distance, moving slowly so as not to disturb them too much. The path circled the cabin twice, then branched out toward a cluster of trees. Just beyond those trunks he spotted something half buried in snow. A small carcass, probably a hare, its body broken and twisted. A few steps further, a larger form, a fox, placed belly up with limbs splayed awkwardly. A pattern emerged. Dead animals arranged radially around the cabin, like some eerie perimeter. Their wounds were peculiar. No clean kill marks, just mangled bodies and torn hide. It was as if they'd been dropped from a great height or crushed with deliberate force. He knelt by the fox and examined it more closely. The ribs were shattered inward, as though something had pressed down from above. There were no obvious bite marks. The ground beneath it had strange indentations, similar to the ones around the cabin. He pressed his fingers into the snow, feeling a hardened crust that had formed overnight. Whatever visited here had taken its time, lingering around the cabin, leaving these grotesque markers as if to warn or intimidate. The silence bore down on him. He felt an urge to return to the cabin's relative shelter, though he loathed the thought of being cornered again. He turned back, and as he did, he thought he saw a faint shadow dart between distant firs. He raised the rifle, but the shape was gone, leaving only the sway of a branch. It could have been a trick of the light, or it could have been the being that made these tracks. Back inside, he stoked the stove and paced, heart pounding. He needed a plan. The blizzard still raged deeper in the forest, and he doubted escape was easy. Survival meant facing what lurked here. He mapped out a small perimeter inside the cabin, deciding where best to fortify. If those things, whatever they were, came again, he needed a better tactical advantage. He inspected every inch of the interior and found loose floorboards in one corner. Under them lay a hollow space filled with nondescript debris, old cloth, a chipped tin cup, and something else, carved symbols etched into the underside of the plank. Curving lines and rough circles, they looked primitive, ritualistic. He let the plank settle back into place and went to the walls. Knife in hand, he scraped away grime and splinters to see if more markings hid beneath. He found some near the stove and at the window frame, crooked lines and strange sigils. They reminded him vaguely of old trapper codes he'd once encountered, marks left to ward off trespassers or guide trusted friends. But these symbols were more twisted, less language-like. He tried to recall any lore or legend that might fit what he'd seen. Strange creatures, odd tracks, and carvings in abandoned cabins. Nothing concrete came to mind, only fragments of stories from old hunting partners who spoke of eerie happenings far in the north. He checked the barricade at the door. The chair was still wedged against it. He'd readied a tripwire that, if triggered, would set off a loud clatter of pans he'd found stashed in a drawer. Rudimentary, but it might give him a split-second warning. Sitting at the table, he methodically cleaned his rifle. He dismantled and wiped it down, ensuring the action was smooth. The steady, familiar task grounded him. With ammunition counted and placed in orderly rows, he felt more himself. His sidearm's weight at his hip comforted him as well. He might not understand what stalked these woods, but he knew how to handle a weapon. As afternoon light dimmed, he knew he'd soon face another long night. He considered making a break for it, forging through the thinning storm to reach some known landmark. But he had no clear sense of direction, and leaving now, uncertain and encumbered by deep snow, could spell death. No, he would wait. He resolved to end this standoff on his own terms. He listened carefully to the wind, noticing subtle changes. It hissed at times, and at others it died down, giving way to a silence that seemed to expand. Twice he thought he heard distant cracks, maybe branches breaking. He moved to the window and glanced out. The day's meager light was failing, painting the forest in dusky blues. Among the dark trunks he saw something, a tall form, half hidden, leaning forward as if peering at him. He froze. The shape seemed to tilt its head, curious or mocking. He raised his rifle, aiming through the glass, finger tense on the trigger. For a moment he considered firing. But what if it only provoked them? When he blinked, the figure vanished. He lowered the rifle slowly, teeth clenched. Evening was coming, and soon they would come closer. He spent the last of the twilight transforming the cabin into a fortification. He hammered nails he found in a rusted tin can into cracks around the window, creating makeshift spikes. He arranged furniture so that he'd have clear lines of fire toward the door and the window. If they came, he wanted to see them, to hit them hard before they closed in. He checked the stove once more, feeding it just enough wood to maintain a glow. Too much light might give them a target, too little, and he'd fumble in darkness. Outside, the wind shifted again. The storm slackened, and a peculiar calm settled. He waited, gun raised, straining to catch any hint of movement or sound. The cabin's wooden frame pressed in on him. Every beam, every plank seemed pregnant with silent tension. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then he heard it, a soft pressure on the roof. Not a tap or scratch, but more like weight settling above his head. He stiffened, pointing the rifle upward as if expecting the ceiling to split. The boards creaked under some burden. He followed the sound as it moved slowly toward the edge where the chimney rose. He remembered the rattling he'd heard in the stovepipe. Now he realized something might have tried to enter that way. He lined up a shot where the chimney met the wall. A gambit. If he heard it break through, he'd fire. For now it remained still. Was it testing his reaction? A sudden thud at the doorframe made him swing around, heart pounding. The door shuddered as if pushed by enormous force. He braced himself. Another blow landed, splintering wood. He aimed at head height and fired through the door. The rifle's roar reverberated, and he heard a muffled thump outside, then silence. He reloaded with deft efficiency, his face set in grim lines. He'd hit something, but he had no way of knowing what effect it had. Moments later, the cabin's back wall groaned. He cursed under his breath, realizing they might try multiple points of entry. He edged closer, sidearm drawn, ready to fire at any gap that appeared. Suddenly, the window darkened. A shape pressed against it, some massive outline blotting out what dim moonlight there was. He fired the pistol twice, bullets punching through the glass and sending shards flying. A hideous, half-seen form recoiled. He caught a glimpse of elongated limbs, an impossible curve of a spine, and a glint like wet bark before it vanished into darkness. He inhaled, sweat trickling down his neck despite the cold. The attack was coordinated. He could feel it. More than one creature, perhaps many, circled outside. The door rattled again, and he fired a second rifle shot, this time lower, hoping to shatter whatever limb tried to break through. No scream sounded, just a heavy thud as something fell away. The silence returned, more suffocating than before. He held his position, rifle cradled tight, awaiting the next move. They came at him in waves. He had no other word for it. The next assault began with a sudden scraping sound along the roof, like something huge dragging itself over the shingles. He aimed up, but there was no easy shot. Then the back wall shuddered again, and a crack appeared between two planks. Through it he glimpsed an eye, if it was an eye, large, dark, reflective, and utterly inhuman. It blinked sideways, a reptilian shudder of lids. He fired his rifle at that spot, splinters and a foul-smelling fluid spraying through the gap. The creature jerked back, leaving him gasping at the stench. He half expected a howl or a scream, some acknowledgement of pain, but nothing came. They were unnervingly silent, communicating through presence and force rather than cries. Another impact on the door sent shards of wood into the room. He rotated and fired again methodically, with the composure of a man who'd faced down charging boar. He landed several shots through the weakening barrier, each time rewarded only by a retreating shadow. He worked the bolt of the rifle, focused on action, reload, aim, fire, his training keeping fear at bay. His sidearm barked twice when one of them tried to press a twisted limb through a gap near the window. He saw bone and something like bark or chitin shatter under his bullets. An acrid odor filled the cabin, making his eyes water. Between attacks, he caught glimpses of their forms. They were tall and angular, blending with the tree line. Their limbs bent in unnatural angles, their torsos elongated, and their skin, if it was skin, gleamed darkly. Sometimes he swore they folded themselves like collapsing tripods, sinking into the snow to vanish, only to rise again somewhere else. The flash of muzzle fire revealed unnatural silhouettes, and between each shot the world snapped back to darkness and silence. At one point, as he reloaded, he remembered the journal he'd yet to find. He had hoped to learn something from this place's past occupants. He needed knowledge, but right now he had no time. He fired another round through the door, trying to push them back to gain a few seconds' respite. His ears rang and his shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. He realized he was winning this deadly tug of war. Though they kept pressuring him, they had not breached fully. The sturdy wood and his accurate marksmanship seemed to hold them at bay. Then, without warning, the pressure eased. The final rattling of the walls ceased, and the heavy, unnatural presence receded. Silence and darkness reclaimed the night. He stood there, chest heaving, the rifle's barrel hot, and wondered if he'd driven them away or merely earned a pause in their assault. He checked his ammunition, still enough for another fight if it came to that. The terrible quiet hung in the aftermath, as if the cabin itself were stunned. He waited, not daring to trust that they were gone for good. Dawn broke as a pale smear behind thinning clouds. He stood amid the wreckage inside the cabin, eyes gritty and shoulders stiff. He'd survived the night, though the memory of those silent attackers would not leave him easily. Bullet casings lay scattered on the floor, along with splinters of wood and shards of glass. He cleared the debris with slow, deliberate motions, trying to regain some sense of order. Eventually, he dared step outside. The wind had faded to a whisper. Snow lay in a patchwork of churned drifts, many marked by curious stains, dark patches in the white. He approached one such spot where he'd fired at a figure lurking at the wall. Instead of blood, he found a viscous, black-brown fluid, already congealing and partly absorbed by the snow. Disturbing it with the tip of his boot, he saw it fizzle and evaporate in the frigid air, leaving behind a faint residue, as if it didn't belong in this world. He circled the cabin. There were splintered fragments embedded in nearby trees, wood torn from the cabin walls, and strange impressions in the snow that looked half-melted, as though the attacker's presence had generated heat. No corpses, no solid evidence of what he'd fought, only the lingering unease that something utterly alien had stalked him. Back inside, he resolved to learn more. He removed the loose floorboards, searching more thoroughly. Under them, he discovered a tin strongbox. Its hinges had rusted, but after prying it open with his knife, he found an oilskin-wrapped booklet inside. He carefully unfolded it and discovered a journal, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. He sat by the stove, feeding it a bit of kindling to coax a steady glow, and began to read. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, switching between English and what looked like phonetic transcriptions of strange words. It told the story of 3 fur trappers who had used the cabin as a winter base generations ago. They wrote about successful hunts at first, then about stumbling onto something they couldn't explain. Odd footprints, mutilated carcasses of woodland creatures, and strange symbols etched into the bark of ancient trees. The entries grew increasingly frantic. The trappers mentioned voices not heard but felt, a sense of being herded. They described conducting desperate rituals borrowed from fragmented folklore, lighting fires in certain patterns, sacrificing small animals in the hopes of appeasing what lurked beyond the tree line. One entry mentioned a doorway, a rift opened by foolish curiosity, letting these beings slip through. They hinted that the creatures were older than the forest itself, not demons or spirits in any common sense, but intruders from somewhere else entirely. The final page bore a hastily scrawled warning. They do not fear cold nor bullets easily, know their weakness, disruptions to their form, fire and iron, aim true, strike where their limbs join. It ended abruptly, with ink smeared as if the writer had been dragged away mid-sentence. He closed the journal, skin crawling. Now he knew a bit more, enough to be truly afraid. The morning sky offered a marginally clearer horizon. The storm had receded enough to reveal more of the terrain, a thicket to the northeast, a ridge line to the west, and beyond it, perhaps the main trail if he could navigate it properly. He considered fleeing now that daylight gave him a better chance. But before he set off, he realized something. If he left the cabin without finishing what the journal hinted was possible, banishing them, would he be stalked forever, driven mad by these things? The journal's last words lingered in his mind, urging direct confrontation armed with knowledge. He stepped outside with deliberate caution, rifle cradled, sidearm at the ready. The forest stood quiet and wrong, as if every living creature had abandoned it. There were no bird songs, no rustle of squirrels, a hush that pressed in from all sides. Scanning the perimeter, he found a series of markings on nearby tree trunks, ragged gouges in the bark, arranged in tight clusters. Following them, he noticed the snow thinning where something large had moved repeatedly. These fresh signs pulled him deeper into the woods, away from the relative safety of the cabin. After pushing through a screen of pines, he came upon a half-collapsed shed he'd not spotted before. It hunkered low under the weight of old snow, its roof sagging and its door missing. Inside, he saw old metal traps, rusted through, and lengths of chain tangled in a corner. As he approached, the air changed. He felt a density, as if stepping into a pocket of heavier atmosphere. The trees seemed warped here, their limbs twisting at unsettling angles. He raised the rifle, scanning the gloom. The presence he sensed was not subtle. It felt like standing before a hidden predator that could spring at any second. Inch by inch he advanced, boots crunching softly. Then he saw it, a towering shape lurking in the half-light behind the shed. Taller than a man by half, it stood unnaturally still, leaning slightly as if balanced on too few limbs. He dared not blink. He aimed center mass, recalling the journal's hint, strike where their limbs join, disrupt their form. He crept closer, heart pounding. The entity shifted slightly, revealing a form that defied logic, too many joints, limbs bending in loops. Its surface gleamed like oily bark, with dark eyes and sharp teeth and claws. Slowly, he adjusted his aim, studying the junctures at its shoulders, hips, and neck. The creature made no sound, yet its presence roared in his mind, primal and oppressive. He fired a careful shot into a limb joint. The bullet's impact triggered a convulsion of shape. It folded inward, limbs curling as if trying to hide its vulnerability. He fired again, sidearm, now. Rounds punching through layers of alien flesh. A viscous fluid spewed forth, evaporating into foul mist. The thing staggered, half collapsing under its own twisting frame. Now he understood. He could hurt it. He could end this. The creature writhed, limbs scraping together, folding into unnatural angles, as if it struggled to maintain a shape in this world. He stepped forward, rifle steady, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Every muscle in his body hummed with tension. He could not let it escape. If it fled, it might return, bringing others, laying more traps. He had to finish what he started. He aimed at the core of it, where the limbs joined in a tangled knot of impossible anatomy, and fired. The shot tore through layers of that oily hide. A hissing crackle answered him. For the first time, he sensed a reaction akin to pain. The creature's torso bent double, twisting in on itself. With grim resolve, he reloaded and fired again. Each bullet chipped away at its coherence. He understood now that these beings were intruders, held together by something beyond normal biology. Disrupt their form, and they fell apart like rotten scaffolding. As he pressed his advantage, the forest around him changed. The oppressive hush lifted slightly. Wind stirred at the edges of the clearing, rustling stiff branches. He saw a flicker of movement behind him. Another of the shapes, smaller or more distant, sliding between trees. He swung the rifle, but it retreated into the gloom. No, this was the one that mattered, the one before him, perhaps a leader or gatekeeper. The journal had implied that by harming or banishing these entities, he might close the door they'd entered from. He fired again, splintering what looked like a critical joint. The creature's flesh, if that's what it was, shuddered, broke apart, and began to dissolve. Dark fluid steamed off the snow. Chunks of limb deflated, collapsing into thin membranes that curled like burning paper. It gave off a sickening smell, acrid and electric. He stepped back, covering his mouth, watching as it melted into nothing more than a greasy stain that quickly evaporated, leaving only disturbed snow and broken twigs. For a moment, he stood in disbelief. Was it truly gone? He scanned the perimeter, rifle at the ready. No ambush followed. No second wave descended upon him. The woods remained still, yet the malevolent aura dissipated. He could breathe again, feel the cold air as simply cold, not charged with menace. He trekked back to the cabin, wary but hopeful. The snow underfoot felt normal now, no longer hiding 1,000 lurking horrors. At the cabin, he gathered his gear, took one last look inside. The walls bore scars, the door splintered, and the symbols carved into the timber remained inscrutable. He snatched the journal and slipped it into his pack. Its warnings and lessons had saved his life. Stepping into a wan gray morning, he began to walk. The storm had eased to a light flurry, and through breaks in the trees he thought he could make out a familiar ridgeline. He pressed on. He made it out of the forest by dusk the following day, stumbling onto a narrow service road where a county snowplow rumbled through the whitened landscape. 2 days later, he sat in a diner on the edge of a quiet town, warming his stiff fingers around a mug of black coffee. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, and a weatherman's voice droned from a television mounted in a corner, announcing milder conditions ahead. No one here knew about the horrors in that remote cabin. They would attribute his haggard face and wary eyes to the hardships of the blizzard. He did not speak of what he had seen, how he had fought creatures that belonged nowhere in this world. He simply paid for his coffee, stood, and headed toward a motel room and a long-awaited bed. Far away beyond those warm lights and paved roads, the forest lay quiet. But in its deeper shadows, far from any human trail, the watchers gathered. They balanced atop high branches and slipped silently between trunks. Some still carried the faint scent of cordite and black blood residue from their wounded companion. They did not scream or cry out, for that was not their way. They only observed as he retreated ever farther into the human world, each step taking him from their domain. They watched him go, countless eyes hidden in the timbered gloom. They would remember this hunter who had forced them back. And as he vanished into the safe, civilized landscape, they remained behind, patient and unspeaking, a reminder that something unnatural still lingered in those distant woods, something that could wait as long as it needed for their revenge. The towering sequoias loomed over the restricted zone like ancient sentinels, their thick branches twisting together to block out the sun. Ranger Eric Tate adjusted the strap of his rifle and surveyed the dense woods ahead. Most people thought of Yosemite National Park as a place of serenity, where natural beauty flourished undisturbed. For Eric, it was something else entirely, a battleground. He had been a ranger for nearly a decade, but it wasn't until 2 years ago that he was offered the job of guarding Area 12. Officially, it didn't exist. The restricted zone wasn't marked on any map, and no tourists ever set foot within its boundaries. The government called it a wildlife conservation area, but Eric knew better. His job wasn't to protect the wildlife, it was to keep it contained. After months of grueling training in tracking, survival, and firearms training and tactics, Eric was sent here with 2 rules. Nothing gets out, and anything suspicious gets reported immediately. Over time, he learned that suspicious covered a wide range of horrors. Area 12 was home to creatures that defied logic. He'd seen things that haunted his dreams, elongated shadows that moved against the wind, eyes that glowed like embers, and shapes that dissolved into mist when pursued. He clicked on his handheld GPS. The boundary was close, marked by a series of buried motion sensors and reinforced fencing camouflaged among the trees. His sidearm, a Glock 19, rested on his hip, but it was his AR-10 rifle he trusted most, a reliable weapon with enough stopping power to handle anything that got too bold. Eric paused as his radio crackled. A familiar, clipped voice came through. "Tate, status check." "Boundary secure," Eric replied. "Nothing to report yet." "Keep it that way," the voice said before cutting out. Eric sighed. The agency wasn't much for small talk. They gave orders and he obeyed. He understood the stakes. If even one of the cryptids escaped, it could spell disaster for the public and for him. Movement caught his eye. He raised the rifle, scanning the underbrush through the scope. A deer burst from the trees, its chest heaving. Eric lowered his weapon, but his relief was short-lived. The deer staggered, its sides streaked with fresh claw marks. It collapsed, legs twitching, and was still. Eric's muscles tensed. Something had spooked it, and it wasn't far. He approached the carcass cautiously, rifle raised. The claw marks were deep, too large for a bear or a mountain lion. The tracks leading away were even stranger, wide, with 3 elongated toes that dug deep into the soil. His earpiece crackled again. "Tate, report." "Possible breach near the northern boundary," Eric said. "Investigating now." "Proceed with caution." Eric nodded to no one in particular and tightened his grip on the rifle. He wasn't just dealing with wildlife here. He was dealing with cryptids, and every instinct told him this was only the beginning. Eric followed the tracks deeper into the restricted zone, his boots crunching against the forest floor. The claw marks gouged into the earth were irregular, as though whatever made them had a loping, uneven gait. He felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Years of experience told him one thing. He was being hunted as much as he was hunting. The forest thickened, the sequoias growing denser, their roots rising like skeletal fingers from the earth. The air seemed heavier here, charged with an unnatural stillness. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even the wind held its breath. Eric stopped abruptly. A faint noise reached his ears, a low guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. He dropped to one knee, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Between the trees, a shadow moved, too large to be a deer and too silent to be a bear. It stopped just out of clear view, the shape obscured by the underbrush. "Come on," Eric muttered under his breath, keeping his aim steady. The shadow shifted, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of it. A creature with mottled, grayish skin stretched tight over its angular frame. Its arms were unnaturally long, almost dragging on the ground, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a dull orange light. Eric's heart thudded in his chest as he recognized it from the briefing files. A skewer, one of the cryptids known for its speed and predatory instincts. It lunged. Eric fired without hesitation. The crack of the rifle echoed through the forest, and the creature snarled as the bullet hit its shoulder, staggering it. It scrambled back into the shadows, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. Eric fired again, the second shot ripping into a tree as the creature disappeared. He stood, his breathing heavy, scanning the forest. He didn't dare follow it deeper into the restricted zone. Not yet. Instead, he checked the tracks. Blood spattered the ground, thick and black with a pungent metallic odor. It was wounded, but not enough to stop it. Skewers were known for their resilience. He'd read reports of bullets failing to kill them outright unless they hit vital points. Eric keyed his radio. Tate reporting, skewer sighting confirmed. Wounded but not neutralized. Boundary still secure. The reply came swiftly. Understood. Reinforce your position. Priority is containment. Containment. Always containment. Eric knew what that meant. He was on his own. Reinforcements never came unless the situation was catastrophic. The growling started again, louder this time, coming from his left. He swung the rifle around, scanning the dense underbrush, but the sound stopped abruptly. The skewer wasn't alone. Eric tightened his grip, his mind racing through his options. If they were coordinating, they'd try to flank him. He shifted his position, keeping his back to a large tree trunk, and switched to his Glock for closer quarters. His training kicked in, instincts honed by years of dealing with dangerous predators. The forest remained silent, but Eric knew the calm wouldn't last. The hunt was far from over. Eric steadied his breathing, his Glock held at the ready. The forest remained still, but he knew better than to trust the silence. Skewers were clever. They didn't attack outright. They tested, prodded, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He scanned the shadows, searching for movement, but nothing stirred. Then, in the distance, he heard it. The faint, rhythmic beeping of a motion sensor tripped near the northern boundary. His stomach dropped. A breach. He moved quickly, holstering the Glock and raising his rifle again. Navigating the forest was second nature, his footsteps silent against the moss-covered ground. As he approached the perimeter, the faint hum of the buried sensors grew louder in his earpiece, signaling where the breach had occurred. A section of the reinforced fencing lay in disarray, its metal strands torn apart as if by immense force. The claw marks etched into the posts confirmed his worst fear. More than one cryptid had been here. "Damn it," Eric muttered, crouching to examine the ground. Tracks crisscrossed the area, some leading deeper into the restricted zone, but others heading toward the open forest beyond the boundary. He placed a hand on the earth, feeling the residual warmth of something that had passed through not long ago. He keyed his radio. Tate reporting, northern boundary compromised, multiple tracks leading out. "Estimate the number," his handler replied, the usual calm, clinical tone masking any hint of concern. "At least 3. 2 heading deeper into the zone. 1, Eric hesitated, tracing a set of prints that veered sharply westward. 1 is outside the boundary. The response was immediate. Neutralize it before it breaches containment further. Priority 1. Eric didn't need to be told twice. He was already moving, following the tracks westward. The path was erratic, the prints doubling back and circling, as though the creature were testing him. He kept his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. Whatever had escaped was dangerous, and if it reached populated areas, the consequences would be catastrophic. The tracks led him to a narrow ravine bordered by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The dense vegetation made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Eric's pulse quickened. This was a perfect ambush site, and the skewers were known for their cunning. A low, guttural growl echoed through the ravine, the sound bouncing off the rocks and making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Eric froze, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision, a blur of grayish skin darting between the rocks. He aimed and fired. The bullet struck stone, sparking off the rock face. The creature let out an enraged screech and launched itself from the shadows, its grotesque form fully visible now. It was taller than Eric had anticipated, its limbs grotesquely elongated and tipped with claws that glinted in the dim light. Its mouth opened in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Eric fired again, this time hitting its chest. The impact sent the creature stumbling backward, but it didn't fall. It lunged at him with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air. Eric barely managed to sidestep, swinging his rifle like a club to knock it off balance. The creature hissed, retreating a few steps, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Blood oozed from the wound in its chest, but it didn't slow down. Eric steadied his aim, his sights locked on its head. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the creature crumpled to the ground. Eric exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. He approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on its unmoving form. The creature's chest no longer rose or fell, and its eyes had dimmed to black. It was dead. He keyed his radio again. 1 skewer neutralized. Boundary compromised but contained for now. Good work, his handler said. Reinforce the area and continue patrol. Containment is critical. Eric looked at the torn fencing in the distance. This was only the beginning. Something was stirring within Area 12, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for what came next. Eric worked quickly to patch the torn fencing. It wasn't a permanent solution, but the temporary repair would slow down anything else trying to escape. The reinforced steel cables were designed to withstand the force of the creatures, but something had managed to tear through them as if they were little more than thread. That realization gnawed at him as he fastened the final cable and surveyed the boundary. The forest was still unnervingly quiet. He glanced at his watch. The sun would set soon, and night patrols in Area 12 were exponentially more dangerous. Most cryptids became bolder in the dark, their movements faster, their hunting more calculated. As he finished his repairs, his radio crackled with static, followed by an unfamiliar voice. Anyone on this frequency? Hello, we're lost. Eric froze. Civilians. His blood ran cold at the implications. He pressed the button to reply, his voice firm. This is Ranger Eric Tate. Identify yourselves. A man responded, his voice strained with panic. We're hikers. We got off the trail hours ago. My wife's hurt, twisted her ankle. We saw some fencing and thought we could cut through to find help. Eric's jaw tightened. That's a restricted area. Stay where you are. I'll find you. No, you don't understand. Something's out here with us, the man said, his voice dropping to a frightened whisper. We saw... I don't know what it was, but it's stalking us. Eric felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The breach earlier hadn't just been dangerous for the public. It had already drawn victims into the zone. He grabbed his gear, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and switching on his GPS. I'm on my way. Do not move. Stay together and stay quiet. The radio went silent, and Eric set off toward their coordinates, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. Every step brought a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the hikers that worried him. It was whatever had lured them into Area 12. The hikers' signal was weak, distorted by the dense canopy above. As he drew closer, he noticed signs of their presence. A discarded water bottle, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. But there were other signs, too, subtle impressions in the dirt, the faint stink of decay hanging in the air. Whatever had breached the boundary was tracking them. Eric quickened his pace, his eyes darting between the trees. The light was fading fast, the shadows lengthening. He activated the flashlight mounted on his rifle, its beam cutting through the gloom. Hello? A voice called out faintly from ahead. Eric recognized the man from the radio. I'm coming to you. Stay calm, Eric called back. As he crested a small ridge, he saw them. A man and a woman huddled together against the base of a massive tree, their faces pale and drawn. The woman clutched her ankle, a makeshift bandage wrapped around it. Relief flickered in the man's eyes when he saw Eric, but it was short-lived. From the shadows behind them, something moved. Eric raised his rifle instinctively. Get down, he barked. The man froze, his mouth opening to protest, but Eric didn't have time to explain. He fired a warning shot into the darkness, the crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. A guttural snarl answered, deep and resonant. The hikers scrambled to the ground as Eric stepped between them and the advancing shadow. The creature emerged, its grotesque form illuminated by the flashlight. It was similar to the skewer he'd killed earlier, but larger, its muscles rippling under its mottled skin. It moved on all fours, its claws digging into the earth with each step. Eric fired, the bullet slamming into its shoulder. It let out a roar of pain but didn't stop. He fired again, aiming for the head, but the creature was already charging. Run! Eric shouted, pulling his sidearm as the beast closed the distance. The hikers hesitated for a moment before scrambling to their feet and fleeing into the forest. Eric stood his ground, unloading the Glock into the creature as it lunged for him. It staggered, its momentum carrying it past him and into a tree. He turned, firing the last round into the base of its skull. The creature collapsed with a heavy thud, its body twitching once before going still. He reloaded quickly, his breaths coming fast. In the distance he heard the hikers yelling, their voices receding into the trees. He keyed his radio, his voice sharp. Hikers found, target neutralized. But deep down, Eric knew this was far from over. Eric trudged through the forest, his steps deliberate and silent despite the urgency thrumming in his veins. He needed to find the hikers before another cryptid did. The forest was fully cloaked in darkness now, the faint glow of his rifle-mounted flashlight, his only guide. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He knew he couldn't stay here for long. The cryptids would be regrouping. The hiker's trail was easy to follow. They left a clear path of broken branches, disturbed foliage, and smeared blood from the woman's injured ankle. Eric muttered a curse under his breath. They were practically a beacon for anything hunting in these woods. His earpiece crackled, and he immediately halted, pressing himself against a tree. A deep, guttural growl reached him, not from his radio, but from somewhere ahead. He crouched, slowly advancing, his rifle raised. The flashlight beam swept across the forest floor, landing on a strange formation of rocks and dense underbrush. Something about the area felt wrong. As he approached, Eric saw the signs: twisted branches arranged in unnatural patterns, charred patches of earth, and bones, animal and human alike, scattered like grim confetti. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and his stomach turned. He had found their lair. At the center of the clearing was an entrance to a cave, its mouth jagged and black, as if the earth itself had split open. The hiker's trail led directly to it. Eric's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a cryptid lair. It was the center of their activity, a place they clearly defended fiercely. He clicked his radio. Tate reporting found a probable cryptid nesting site, evidence of multiple casualties, including human remains, proceeding with caution. "Do not engage unless necessary," his handler replied, the static-laden voice devoid of emotion. "Reinforce the boundary and retreat if needed." Eric grimaced. Reinforce and retreat? That wasn't an option if the hikers were inside. He couldn't live with leaving them to their fate. Tightening his grip on his rifle, he pressed forward, his flashlight slicing into the cavern's shadowy depths. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The walls were slick with some kind of viscous substance that glistened in the light, and the ground squelched under his boots. Piles of bones were stacked haphazardly, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. A faint, pitiful sound reached him, whimpering. Eric moved quickly, following the sound deeper into the cave. His flashlight revealed the hikers huddled together near a far wall, their faces pale and streaked with tears. The man spotted Eric first, his eyes widening in desperate relief. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "It's still here." Eric raised a hand to silence him and scanned the chamber. The hum grew louder, and a shape emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, crouched low to the ground with a sleek, sinewy frame. Its eyes glowed with the same dull orange light as the others, but this one was different, more intelligent, more calculating. It let out a growl that seemed to reverberate through the cavern, its claws scraping against the stone as it advanced. Eric aimed at its head and fired. The bullet struck true, but the creature barely flinched, its gaze fixed on him. "Move," Eric barked at the hikers, motioning for them to run. They hesitated for only a moment before scrambling past him toward the cave entrance. Eric kept his rifle trained on the creature, firing shot after shot as he backed toward the exit. Each bullet tore into its flesh, but it showed no sign of slowing. He was almost out of the cave when the creature lunged. Eric dropped to one knee and fired a final round directly into its gaping mouth. The creature reeled, its body convulsing as it collapsed. Black ichor spilled across the cavern floor, pooling at Eric's feet. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He turned and sprinted after the hikers. Emerging into the open air, Eric found the hikers trembling just beyond the clearing. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice firm. "Follow my lead." They obeyed, and together they made their way back toward the boundary. Eric's mind raced. If this was just one lair, how many more were hidden in Area 12? And what would it take to truly contain them? Eric guided the hikers through the forest with quick, purposeful steps. His senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the oppressive darkness. The skewer lair wasn't far behind them, and there was no telling how many more creatures were lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. The injured woman stumbled, letting out a sharp cry of pain as her twisted ankle gave out. Her husband caught her, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "We can't go any faster," he said, his voice trembling. "She's hurt." Eric glanced at the treetops, his flashlight flickering over the dense canopy. He could feel the creatures watching them, their predatory gazes pressing against his back like a physical weight. Time was running out. "We stop, we die," Eric said, his voice cold but not unkind. "Put her on your back if you have to. We need to move." The man nodded shakily and hoisted his wife onto his back, grunting under her weight. They resumed their pace, slower than Eric would have liked, but better than staying still. His mind raced as he mentally mapped the path back to the boundary. If they could reach the fencing, the sensors might buy them enough time to radio for an extraction. A guttural snarl pierced the night, low and rumbling, coming from somewhere to their right. Eric spun, raising his rifle and scanning the darkness. His flashlight caught a flash of movement, a pale, elongated limb disappearing behind a tree. "They're flanking us," he muttered. "Keep moving, don't stop." The hikers obeyed, but their pace faltered as the snarls grew louder and more numerous. The creatures weren't just hunting, they were herding. Eric realized too late that they were being funneled into a trap. The forest opened up into a clearing, the ground littered with jagged rocks and twisted roots. The hikers hesitated, but Eric pushed them forward. "Go, the other side of the clearing, now!" As they ran, the skewers emerged from the tree line, their grotesque forms illuminated by the moonlight. There were at least 4 of them, their glowing eyes fixed on Eric and the hikers. They moved with unnerving speed, their limbs contorting as they bounded over the uneven terrain. Eric dropped to one knee, aiming his rifle at the nearest creature. He fired, the bullet striking its chest and sending it sprawling to the ground. Another charged from the left, and he swung his rifle around, firing again. The creature staggered but didn't fall, its claws slashing at the air as it closed the distance. The hikers reached the edge of the clearing, but the woman's screams cut through the chaos. One of the creatures had darted ahead, blocking their path. The husband tried to shield her, but the skewer knocked him aside with a swipe of its massive claw. Eric didn't hesitate. He drew his sidearm and fired 3 quick shots, each one hitting its mark. The skewer let out a piercing shriek before collapsing. Eric rushed forward, pulling the hikers to their feet. "Run!" he shouted, his voice cutting through their panic. "I'll cover you." The remaining skewers circled the clearing, their movements deliberate. Eric backed toward the hikers, firing controlled shots to keep the creatures at bay. His ammo was running low, and the creatures seemed to sense it. They grew bolder, darting closer with each pass. One lunged, its claws slicing through the air. Eric ducked, slamming the butt of his rifle into its head and firing point blank into its chest. The creature fell, writhing, but another was already behind it. Eric fired again, the recoil jarring his shoulder as the shot tore through its shoulder. "Keep going," he yelled over his shoulder. "Don't stop." The hikers disappeared into the tree line, their ragged breaths fading into the distance. Eric stood his ground, his rifle trained on the remaining skewers. They hesitated, snarling, their glowing eyes reflecting their frustration. Eric knew they were testing him, waiting for him to falter. His radio crackled. "Tate, report. Boundary breached, engaged multiple hostiles," he said, his voice strained. "Hikers extracted, returning to boundary." "Understood. Maintain containment." Eric gritted his teeth, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Easy for them to say, sitting in some distant control room while he faced death head-on. He fired one last shot into the air, a warning to the skewers, before retreating into the forest. The boundary was still a mile away, and the hunt wasn't over yet. The sound of his boots pounding against the forest floor mingled with the distant growls of the skewers trailing him. Eric kept his pace steady but purposeful, scanning the shadows as he moved. The hikers were ahead of him, their frantic breathing and occasional stumbling the only signs of their progress. The fence boundary wasn't far, but Eric knew they weren't safe. Not yet. "Keep moving," he barked, glancing back to ensure the creatures hadn't closed the gap. The skewers were relentless hunters, but they also calculated their attacks. They weren't rushing, they were waiting for an opening. As the hikers crested a small hill, the faint metallic gleam of the boundary fence came into view. Relief flickered across their faces, but Eric didn't let his guard down. He motioned for them to stay put while he approached the fence, his rifle at the ready. The motion sensors were intact, their subtle hum reassuring, but the tension in the air told him the cryptids weren't finished. "Climb over," he said, motioning toward the hikers. "Now." The man helped his injured wife up first, her hands fumbling for purchase on the metal as she dragged herself over. Eric kept his rifle trained on the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. The man followed quickly, his landing on the other side clumsy but effective. Eric gave a sharp nod. "Stay low and keep moving along the perimeter. Follow the markers back to the ranger station." "What about you?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "I'll catch up," Eric replied curtly, his attention already shifting back to the forest. The skewers appeared as if conjured by the growing darkness. 3 of them slipped from the shadows, their glowing eyes locking onto Eric. He adjusted his stance, taking a deep breath as he aimed his rifle. He fired once, the shot hitting the lead creature squarely in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall, letting out a guttural snarl that sent the others surging forward. Eric dropped to one knee, firing in quick succession. The second skewer fell, its grotesque limbs twitching as it crumpled to the ground. The third lunged, its claws slicing through the air inches from Eric's head. He rolled to the side, firing his sidearm into its exposed flank. The creature howled, collapsing in a heap, but Eric knew there were more. His radio crackled again, the familiar detached voice of his handler cutting through the static. "Tate, status." "Boundary reinforced," Eric said, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. 3 hostiles down, but the activity's escalating. Something's stirring them up. There was a brief pause before the voice replied. "Return to base. Debrief immediately." Eric hesitated. The agency rarely called him back unless something significant had shifted. He glanced at the boundary, ensuring the hikers were well on their way, then turned and began retracing his steps toward the base camp. The ranger station was a small fortified outpost hidden deep within the restricted zone. Eric entered through the reinforced door, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights greeted him, along with the low, steady beeping of monitoring equipment. A man in a dark suit was waiting for him, his expression unreadable. Eric had seen him before, a handler from the agency, always brief and vague. He was the kind of man who never gave more information than was absolutely necessary. "You found their lair," the man said, his tone devoid of surprise. "Yeah, and a lot more than that," Eric replied, setting his rifle on the table. The hikers stumbled into the zone, and something's pushing the cryptids closer to the boundary. The handler nodded, as if this were expected. "Activity has been increasing for months. We've theorized the skewers are adapting, possibly communicating." Eric frowned. "You're telling me they're getting smarter?" "Not just smarter," the handler said. "More organized. They've been testing the boundaries. This breach wasn't random. It was a coordinated effort." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. "And you waited until now to tell me?" The handler shrugged. "Your job is containment. Knowing their tactics doesn't change that." Eric stared at the man, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. If they're evolving, how long before containment isn't enough? The handler's expression darkened. "That's why you're here, Ranger Tate, to ensure that doesn't happen." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had started. The handler handed Eric a new set of coordinates, another section of the zone requiring reinforcement. The message was clear: no rest, no reprieve. Eric returned to the forest, his mind racing. The agency knew more than they let on, and the cryptids weren't the only thing he was beginning to distrust. Eric moved through the forest with a renewed sense of purpose and unease. The coordinates given by the handler led to a remote section of the boundary he hadn't patrolled in months. This area, deeper within the restricted zone, was rumored to be home to the largest concentrations of cryptids. If the skewers were testing boundaries here, it meant one thing. They were preparing for a mass breakout. The wind picked up as he approached the designated area, carrying with it the sharp metallic scent of blood. His boots crunched against the ground littered with broken branches and tufts of fur, evidence of a recent struggle. Eric activated the motion sensors near the boundary, their faint beeps confirming activity nearby. The forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between trees, the sound of claws scratching bark echoing in the stillness. He felt their presence before he saw them. The skewers were gathering, their guttural growls and snorts blending into a chorus of predatory hunger. Eric stopped at the base of a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The boundary fence stretched across the terrain, its reinforced steel cables glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beyond it, dozens of cryptids were emerging from the trees. The skewers moved like a pack of wolves, their elongated limbs twisting as they stalked the perimeter. Behind them, hulking shapes lingered in the shadows, larger, more grotesque creatures Eric had only seen in agency briefings. These were no ordinary cryptids. They were something far worse. He keyed his radio. "Tate reporting. We've got a serious situation. Multiple hostiles at the southern boundary. They're testing the fence, preparing to breach." The response was immediate. "Do not let them breach, Tate. Reinforcements are unavailable. You're on your own." Eric swallowed hard, suppressing the anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. Typical. He was always alone when it mattered most. Adjusting the scope on his rifle, he zeroed in on the lead skewer, a particularly large one pacing near the boundary. His first shot rang out, the crack of the rifle breaking the stillness. The bullet struck the creature's chest, sending it sprawling. The others reacted instantly, their glowing eyes snapping toward him. They let out unearthly shrieks and charged toward the fence, claws tearing at the ground. Eric fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. The boundary sensors flared as the creatures slammed into the fencing, their claws raking against the reinforced steel. Sparks flew as they tested its strength, their collective weight pressing against it like a tidal wave. The ground shook as one of the larger cryptids emerged from the shadows, a massive, lumbering beast with thick, mottled skin and jagged protrusions along its spine. It roared, its deep, resonant bellow vibrating in Eric's chest. This was no skewer. It was something far worse, and it wasn't stopping at the fence. Eric reached into his pack, pulling out the emergency explosives he'd been issued for last-ditch containment. He set the charges along the ridge, positioning them to collapse the valley entrance if the creatures breached the boundary. The skewers were relentless, their claws tearing into the fencing with unnatural strength. The larger cryptid barreled forward, its immense bulk bending the steel cables. "Come on, you bastard," Eric muttered, firing at the massive creature's head. The bullets barely slowed it, glancing off its thick hide like pebbles. It reached the fence, its claws wrapping around the cables and ripping them apart with a deafening screech. Eric triggered the explosives. The valley erupted in a fiery explosion, the shock wave knocking him off his feet. Dirt and debris rained down as the ridge collapsed, sending massive boulders crashing into the valley below. The fence crumpled under the weight, and the cryptids disappeared beneath a cloud of dust and rubble. Eric scrambled to his feet, coughing as he surveyed the destruction. The valley was sealed, the boundary reinforced by the natural barrier of fallen rocks. The motion sensors beeped faintly, signaling the absence of movement. For now, the cryptids were contained. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Tate reporting. Breach contained. Valley sealed with explosives. Situation under control." The handler's voice came through, as emotionless as ever. "Good work, Ranger Tate. Return to base for debriefing." Eric stared into the valley, his grip tightening on his rifle. The creatures would regroup, adapt, and try again. Eric trudged back toward the ranger station, his body aching from the explosive shockwave. His uniform was torn, streaked with dirt and sweat, and the adrenaline that had kept him sharp through the encounter was fading fast, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The forest around him felt eerily calm now, the aftermath of his desperate stand leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. The hike back to base was grueling, every step a reminder of the narrow escape he and the hikers had just endured. He thought of them, terrified but alive. He had done his part, even if the agency's priorities weren't always clear about saving civilians. Containment was their mission, but Eric couldn't ignore the people caught in the crossfire. When he reached the station, its reinforced steel door glinting under the dim light of the moon, he punched in his access code and entered. The stark interior, all metal and concrete, felt suffocating after the open forest. The hum of the monitoring equipment filled the space, accompanied by the faint crackle of static from the station's communications console. He sank into the chair at the desk, his rifle resting across his knees. The radio crackled, and his handler's voice came through. "Tate, we need your report." Eric sighed, running a hand through his dirt-streaked hair. Breach was significant, at least 20 skewers and something else, bigger, stronger. It tore through the fencing like it was paper. There was a pause on the other end before the handler replied. Describe the larger entity. "Built like a tank," Eric said, his tone grim. "Thick, spined hide, claws like goddamn steel hooks. My rounds barely slowed it. Took explosives to bring it down, and even then I'm not sure it's dead." Another pause, then, noted. "Reinforcement of that boundary section will be prioritized." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Reinforcement? It's rubble now. The only reason it's holding is because the ridge has collapsed." "Containment achieved," the handler said flatly, as if that solved everything. Eric leaned back, his exhaustion giving way to frustration. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You've been tracking the increase in activity, the coordination. Why wasn't I told?" "Our job is to ensure containment, not to share unverified data," the handler replied. "You performed as expected." "As expected?" Eric snapped, his voice rising. "I'm out here alone fighting things you won't even name, and you can't give me a straight answer about what the hell is going on." The handler's voice remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "Your position is critical, Ranger Tate. You understand the importance of the work. If you'd like to terminate your contract, we can arrange for a replacement." Eric stared at the radio, the weight of those words settling on him. Terminate his contract. Leave Area 12 in someone else's hands. He thought of the hikers, the breach, the growing intelligence of the cryptids. He couldn't walk away, not when he was the only one standing between those creatures and the outside world. "Keep your replacement," Eric said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." "Understood," the handler replied. "Your next assignment will arrive shortly. Rest while you can." The radio went silent, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and stared at the map of Area 12 pinned to the wall. Red markers indicated previous breaches, their frequency increasing in recent months. He traced his finger along the southern boundary, now sealed by his explosives, and then to the deeper sections of the restricted zone marked only with vague warnings. What was in those uncharted areas? The agency knew, but they weren't telling. And yet they relied on him to keep the cryptids contained, armed with only what little information they deemed necessary. He shook his head, feeling the weight of the impossible task settling on his shoulders once again. After a long moment, Eric stood, grabbed a rag, and began cleaning his rifle. The familiar ritual calmed his mind, grounding him in the simple, practical actions of maintenance. He wasn't here to understand the cryptids or the agency's secrets. He was here to do a job. And as long as the creatures stayed in Area 12, he'd keep doing it. The sun rose slowly over the treetops, its warm light filtering through the thick canopy and casting long shadows across the forest floor. Eric stood at the boundary, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The reinforced steel cables and buried sensors were intact for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. The cryptids never stopped testing, never stopped searching for a weakness. They were relentless. He shifted his stance, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his ribs. The injuries from the previous night were minor compared to what they could have been, but they served as a stark reminder of how close he had come to failure. Failure, in his line of work, didn't just mean death, it meant catastrophe. Eric's radio crackled. "Tate, status check. Boundary secure," he replied. His voice was steady, betraying none of the exhaustion he felt. "No movement." "Understood. Continue patrol." The line went silent again, leaving him alone with the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped hesitantly, their calls gradually returning as the chaos of the night faded. Eric found himself envying their ignorance. They didn't know what lurked just beyond the trees, what monstrous shapes prowled the shadows. But he did. He walked along the boundary, his steps methodical, his eyes sharp. Every so often he stopped to check the motion sensors, ensuring the system was functioning properly. The explosive collapse of the valley had bought them time, but the cryptids would adapt. They always did. As he moved, his mind wandered to the hikers. He had no doubt the agency would ensure their silence, either through intimidation or something more final. That was the cost of containment, secrets kept at any cost. He'd done his best to save them, but he wouldn't see them again. That was just as well. The less they knew about him, the safer they'd be. Reaching a small clearing, Eric paused, his gaze drifting to the dense forest beyond the boundary. The shadows there seemed deeper, darker, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to hide what lay within. He thought of the skewers, of the larger creature that had nearly torn through the fence, and of the unexplored regions of Area 12. What else was out there, waiting to test the limits of his endurance? He didn't want to know, but he would find out. That was the job. Eric adjusted the strap of his rifle and turned back toward the ranger station. The agency would keep sending him to reinforce the boundaries, to patrol the woods, to face down the horrors that humanity wasn't ready to know existed. And he would keep answering the call. Not because he trusted the agency, but because he understood the stakes. If he didn't do this job, who would? Back at the station, he cleaned his weapons, patched his gear, and prepared for the next call. He knew it would come soon. The cryptids weren't finished, and neither was he. As the shadows deepened once more over Area 12, Eric stood ready, a silent protector armed with a rifle, a sidearm, and the resolve to hold the line. Whatever came next, he would face it, because that was what the job demanded. The morning was heavy with mist as Eric Tate stood outside the ranger station, the weight of exhaustion pressing against his bones. Yesterday's chaos still lingered in his mind, the skewers breaching the boundary, the hikers' terrified faces, the explosion that had collapsed the valley. The boundary was sealed, temporarily, but the cryptids would be back. They always were. His radio crackled. "Tate, report to command, new assignment." Eric suppressed a groan, grabbed his rifle, and made his way toward the station's communications room. Inside, a secure monitor flickered to life, revealing the grim face of his handler. The man's dark suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. "Eric," the handler began, "we've detected unusual seismic activity in the center of Area 12. It's spreading outward. We need you to investigate." Eric frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "Seismic? You mean an earthquake?" "Not exactly. The patterns are irregular," the handler replied, his tone deliberately vague. "Proceed to these coordinates." A new location blinked on Eric's GPS, far deeper into the restricted zone than he'd ever gone before. Eric narrowed his eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing relevant," the handler said curtly. "Just do your job, Ranger Tate." The screen went black. Eric cursed under his breath, shouldered his gear, and headed out. The coordinates on his GPS led him miles into the heart of Area 12, territory untouched for years, where even the agency's surveillance equipment rarely functioned. That didn't sit right with him, but his orders were clear. The forest grew darker as Eric pushed deeper, the towering sequoias growing denser and twisted. The air felt heavier, charged with a subtle hum that vibrated in his chest. Every step made him more uneasy, as though something watched him from the shadows. Hours passed before he finally spotted it. A steep hill, unnatural in shape, rising above the forest floor. At its base, half hidden by tangled vines, was something that didn't belong, a set of reinforced steel doors embedded into the earth. Eric froze, his rifle instinctively raised. The doors were massive, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like eyes. His stomach twisted. This wasn't standard agency work. He approached cautiously, sweeping his flashlight over the area. The steel doors showed no signs of rust or decay. Whatever this place was, it was active. His radio crackled. "Tate," the handler's voice said, "you've arrived." Eric stiffened. "You knew about this place?" "Yes," the handler admitted. "You are authorized to enter. Proceed." Eric's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. He ran his hand across the door's cold surface, finding a control panel hidden beneath the vines. A few buttons later, the door shuddered and began to slide open, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. A faint, unnatural hum emanated from below, growing louder as the doors opened wider. Eric's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he gripped his rifle tighter and stepped inside. Whatever lay at the end of that tunnel, he would find it. Eric descended the sloping tunnel cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through his boots and into his bones. The walls were smooth, metallic, and lined with conduits pulsing faintly with light, like veins carrying some kind of energy. This wasn't an old bunker or storage site. It was something far more advanced. The air shifted as Eric reached the bottom of the tunnel. A heavy door loomed before him, glowing slightly around the edges. He spotted a small biometric scanner set into the wall. He hesitated, glancing back up the tunnel. The surface seemed impossibly far away, as though the earth itself had swallowed him. "You knew about this place." The handler's words echoed in his mind. "Damn it," Eric muttered. He scanned the panel and pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The room beyond caught him off guard. It was a lab, massive, sterile, and bright, with high-tech workstations lining the walls. The hum he'd heard emanated from a colossal structure in the center of the room, a shimmering, swirling rift suspended in a series of mechanical rings. Energy pulsed from it, warping the air around its edges. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once, like staring into the void itself. "Holy..." Eric trailed off, lowering his rifle as he took it in. The room wasn't empty. Scientists in white lab coats moved around the rift, monitoring its movements and recording data on holographic screens. Strange specimens floated in vats along the walls, half-formed cryptids, their grayish flesh twitching unnaturally. This was no accident, no anomaly. This place was designed to study the creatures of Area 12. A voice broke the silence. "You're not supposed to be here, Ranger Tate." Eric spun around, his rifle snapping up. A tall man in a lab coat stepped from the shadows, hands raised in a placating gesture. He was older, his face lined with fatigue and something else, guilt. "Who the hell are you?" Eric demanded. "My name is Dr. Kessler," the man said calmly, "and you're standing in one of the most important research facilities on the planet." Eric's gaze darted to the rift. "You're researching the cryptids? You're keeping this open on purpose?" Kessler nodded, seemingly unbothered by the accusation. "The rift is a doorway, Ranger Tate, a window into another dimension. These creatures don't belong to our world, but they've adapted. Understanding them could save humanity one day." "Save us? From what?" Eric barked. "You're the reason they're spreading." Dr. Kessler's expression darkened. "We're containing them, not spreading them. Everything we do here is necessary." Eric's finger hovered over the trigger. "Necessary? People are dying out there because of this." He gestured to the rift. "And you want me to believe you're helping?" Before Kessler could answer, a klaxon blared. The lights flickered and the hum from the rift shifted in pitch. Eric turned to see the shimmering energy fluctuate, its pulse growing erratic. Scientists scrambled to their stations, their faces etched with panic. "What's happening?" Eric demanded. Kessler's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "It's destabilizing." Eric felt his gut tighten. What the hell does that mean? It means, Kessler said quietly, they're coming through. Eric spun back toward the rift, his rifle snapping up. Shadows flickered within its depths, shapes twisting and clawing toward the light. The cryptids were here. The rift roared to life, its shimmering surface distorting and swelling as shadows clawed their way through. A piercing screech echoed across the lab, metal straining against an unseen force. Scientists scattered, their shouts lost in the din of alarms and energy pulsing from the portal. Eric's instincts screamed at him to move. He shouldered his rifle and backed away, eyes locked on the rippling rift. The first cryptid emerged, a massive, grotesque thing that looked like a hybrid of the skewers and something far worse. Its elongated limbs dragged behind it, claws sparking against the lab floor, its head twisted unnaturally, glowing orange eyes locking onto Eric. "Contain it," Kessler shouted. "Seal the blast doors." "Seal them now!" a panicked scientist screamed, slamming their fist against a control panel. The steel doors began sliding shut, but the creature moved with blinding speed. It slammed into the doors, the impact reverberating through the lab, and forced its claws into the narrowing gap. Sparks flew as metal buckled beneath its strength. Eric didn't wait for an invitation. He opened fire. The crack of his rifle echoed in the chaos, rounds slamming into the cryptid's chest. Black ichor splattered across the walls, but the creature barely flinched. It let out a guttural roar that made Eric's bones vibrate and lunged forward. "Get back!" Eric shouted, pulling a grenade from his vest. He yanked the pin and lobbed it toward the beast. The explosion rocked the lab, smoke and debris filling the air. Eric ducked behind a console as shrapnel pinged off the walls. When he glanced back, the creature was sprawled on the floor, its body twitching, but its glowing eyes still burned. "It's not down," Eric growled, reloading his rifle. "What the hell is this thing?" "It's a riftborn," Kessler said grimly, pulling a scientist to their feet. "Something new. We don't even understand it yet." "Perfect," Eric muttered, firing another burst of rounds into the cryptid. This time the shots struck its head, and the creature spasmed violently before going still. The alarms continued blaring, and a second shadow rippled in the rift. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned toward Kessler, his voice sharp. "Tell me how to shut that thing down. Now." Kessler hesitated, glancing at the shimmering portal. "We can't." "What do you mean, can't?" Eric barked. "It's spewing monsters into the world." Kessler stepped forward, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the surrounding consoles. "All our equipment shows that if we try to close the rift, there could be an explosion, or an implosion of unimaginable size. We cannot risk it." Eric's stomach sank. "Then I guess we're screwed." Before Kessler could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the lab into an eerie half-darkness. Another creature began to emerge from the rift, this one larger and more serpentine, its spined body undulating as it clawed its way free. "We're losing containment," a scientist screamed. Eric didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward a nearby console, sweeping his flashlight over the controls. Kessler shouted something behind him, but Eric's attention was pulled to a new detail, a monitor displaying a faint blueprint of the facility. At its center was the rift, labeled Project Gateway. But beneath it, another schematic caught his eye. Subject E1. Eric squinted, trying to make sense of the data. It showed a human silhouette. His silhouette. Biometric stats were listed alongside it. Reflexes, enhanced. Strength, enhanced. Resilience, prototype, unstable. Eric's blood ran cold. What the hell is this? "Eric," Kessler called softly. "There's something you need to know." Eric turned sharply, his rifle still raised, his voice a low growl. "What am I looking at, Kessler?" Dr. Kessler didn't meet his gaze at first, instead glancing toward the flickering rift where more cryptids threatened to break through. "It's you, Eric," he said quietly. "Subject E1. You're not what you think you are." Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded, his finger twitching against the trigger. Kessler took a step forward, his hands raised in placation. "You were created, Ranger Tate. Engineered. You're a clone, part of a classified program designed to combat the cryptids. The strength, the reflexes, your ability to endure what no one else can. It's not natural. Eric's chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. The impossibly quick recoveries, his endurance against creatures that would rip apart any other human, the way he'd never received reinforcements despite the overwhelming odds. His entire life in Area 12 had been one long lie. "You're telling me I'm a weapon?" Eric said, his voice cold. Kessler nodded, his gaze finally meeting Eric's. "A superhuman clone, fine-tuned for combat against the Riftborn. You were deployed here because you're the best chance we have at containment." Eric took a step back, his mind racing. He glanced at the monitor again, his own stats displayed like a lab rat's experiment. Reflexes, strength, prototype. His whole life reduced to a handful of cold clinical data points. He thought of the handler's words every time he'd asked for backup. "You're on your own." But my memories, my family, all implanted, fabricated to keep you grounded. Please understand. We didn't have a choice. You've seen what comes through that rift. These creatures would overrun the park if not for you containing them. "And you expect me to keep playing along?" Eric snapped, turning his rifle toward Kessler. Before the doctor could answer, the rift pulsed violently, sending shockwaves through the lab. The lights flickered, and a piercing hum reverberated through the room. Eric staggered, steadying himself as the shimmering energy of the rift expanded. A new creature emerged. It was enormous, easily twice the size of the Riftborn Eric had killed earlier. Its sinewy, spined body undulated as it slithered forward, its claws clicking against the steel floor. A deep, unnatural screech escaped its maw, and its orange eyes locked onto Eric like a predator identifying its prey. "We can't hold it!" a scientist screamed. Eric shoved Kessler aside and raised his rifle, his training kicking in. He fired a burst of rounds at the creature's face, the bullets sparking off its thick hide. The Riftborn recoiled but quickly recovered, its serpentine body coiling as it prepared to strike. Kessler scrambled to a console, shouting over the chaos. "Eric, listen to me. If we overload the rift, it'll collapse, but it'll take this whole facility with it. We have no choice now. The Riftborn incursions are not stopping. We will have to risk it." Eric's eyes flickered toward the rift, the pulsating energy throwing grotesque shadows across the room. "And if we don't?" Kessler hesitated. "Then everything gets out." The creature lunged, its claws swiping inches from Eric's face as he dove out of the way. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Fine," Eric growled, reloading. "Tell me how to blow this damn thing up." Kessler's face twisted with hesitation as the lab descended into chaos. The Riftborn screeched, its claws gouging deep furrows into the steel floor, closing the distance between itself and Eric with horrifying speed. Eric fired another burst into its head, but the rounds ricocheted harmlessly off its armored hide. He gritted his teeth. "Kessler!" Eric barked, vaulting over a console as the Riftborn's claw slammed into a workstation, shattering it. "I need answers now. How do we shut that thing down?" Kessler scrambled toward a nearby console, hands flying across the holographic interface. "We can overload the containment generators," he shouted over the alarms. "It'll destabilize the rift and collapse it." Eric's mind raced as he unloaded another magazine into the creature. The bullets only seemed to slow it down, buying him precious seconds. He didn't care about the facility. He didn't care about Kessler's experiments. If the rift collapsed, the cryptids would be contained, but that would include him. "Eric," Kessler shouted desperately, noticing his hesitation. "This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. If the rift stays open, these creatures will breach every boundary, every containment zone. The entire world will be a hunting ground." Eric ducked as the Riftborn smashed a console to his right, sparks raining down around him. He fired again, aiming for its glowing eyes this time. The shot struck true, and the beast shrieked, recoiling briefly. Kessler took the opportunity to activate the overload sequence. A low mechanical whine filled the lab, and the rift pulsed violently, its energy flaring outward like ripples on a pond. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an unnatural force. Eric staggered, his gaze locking onto Kessler. "You're really going to blow this place?" Kessler nodded grimly. "It's the only way. You were designed for this moment, Eric. You have to hold them off long enough for the collapse to complete. Eric clenched his jaw, rage boiling beneath his stoic exterior. I didn't sign up for this. You made me for it. And look what you've accomplished, Kessler shot back, desperation tinging his voice. You've kept the world safe for years. You're not just some weapon, Eric. You're humanity's last line of defense. Eric froze at those words. In his gut, he'd always suspected he was more than just another ranger. The way he healed faster, moved quicker, fought harder, it wasn't natural. And now he knew the truth. They'd made him, engineered him for this exact moment. The Riftborn let out a deafening screech, its serpentine form coiling again, preparing for a final devastating strike. Eric didn't hesitate. He turned to Kessler. How long until the collapse? 5 minutes, Kessler replied. Then you better start running, Eric said coldly. Kessler didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a nearby data drive and sprinted toward the far exit, shouting for the remaining scientists to follow him. Eric turned back to the Riftborn, his grip tightening on his rifle. 5 minutes was all he needed. Whatever he was, man, clone, or weapon, he would finish this fight. Come on, Eric muttered, steadying his aim as the creature lunged. Let's see what you've got. The Riftborn lunged, its massive body closing the distance in a heartbeat. Eric threw himself to the side, landing hard against a console as the creature's claws tore into the ground where he'd been standing. Sparks exploded from shredded equipment, and the lab's emergency lights flickered ominously. Eric scrambled to his feet, reloading his rifle as the Riftborn coiled to strike again. The air thrummed with energy from the destabilizing rift, its glow intensifying, casting long, jagged shadows across the shattered lab. Every instinct told him he was running out of time. He fired again, aiming for the creature's glowing eyes. 2 shots struck home, sending the Riftborn reeling backward with an agonized shriek. Black ichor oozed from its face, but the creature was far from dead. It lowered its head, its glowing gaze now locked onto Eric with animalistic fury. Over the din of the rift and the alarms, Eric heard his radio crackle. Eric! The handler's cold, clipped voice filled his ear. Report your status. Eric's blood boiled at the sound. You already know, he growled, firing another burst as the Riftborn charged again. The creature's claws slashed through the air inches from Eric's head as he ducked and rolled beneath its strike. You knew about this place, about the rift, about me, didn't you? There was a pause. Then the handler's voice came through, calm and deliberate. We knew you would uncover it eventually. Eric froze for half a second, his heart pounding in his chest. So you've been lying to me this whole time? We withheld what you didn't need to know, the handler said coldly. You've always been part of a larger plan, Ranger Tate. A necessary plan. Eric dove behind a steel pillar as the Riftborn's tail lashed out, smashing through a wall and sending debris crashing to the floor. He keyed his radio again, fury burning through his exhaustion. You built me for this job, didn't you? Why didn't I ever get reinforcements? Why am I the only one in Area 12? The handler's tone didn't change. You didn't need reinforcements, Eric. You are the reinforcement. The others couldn't do what you do. Your enhancements, your speed, your strength, your resilience were designed to make you unstoppable. And so far, you haven't proven us wrong. Eric's grip on his rifle tightened as the Riftborn began stalking toward him again, its wounds already starting to heal. Enhancements. The word echoed in his mind, mocking him. He wasn't a hero, wasn't a ranger doing his part to protect the world. He was an experiment, created to fight and die so that others wouldn't have to. The Riftborn lunged, its screech splitting the air. Eric exploded out of cover, unloading his last rounds into its face. The creature staggered, blinded momentarily, giving Eric the chance to sprint to the nearest console. 4 minutes! Kessler's voice crackled faintly over the lab speakers. Eric, the overload is nearly complete. Good, Eric muttered, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. He turned back toward the Riftborn, his pulse steadying. If he was a weapon, then it was time to do what he'd been made for. No reinforcements were coming. There was no cavalry on the horizon. It had always been him, just him. Come on, you ugly bastard, Eric said through gritted teeth. Let's finish this. The Riftborn shrieked, a sound that rattled through the crumbling lab like an earthquake. Its massive body coiled, muscles tensing as it prepared to strike again. The rift's pulsing light grew brighter, erratic waves of energy spilling out and warping the air. Pieces of the ceiling cracked and fell, but Eric didn't move. He planted his boots on the scorched floor, rifle leveled at the monster. His thoughts were a storm of anger, confusion, and a grim resolve. The Riftborn lunged. Eric fired, every shot aimed at its glowing eyes. His enhanced reflexes kicked in. Time seemed to slow as the creature's maw opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. He sidestepped at the last possible moment, spun, and unloaded the remainder of his magazine into the back of its head. The creature roared, thrashing violently. Eric dove behind a console as the beast's tail smashed into a support column, sending a shockwave through the room. He landed hard, the impact jarring his ribs, but he pushed himself back up, adrenaline dulling the pain. His radio crackled with Kessler's voice. 2 minutes, Eric. The rift's collapsing. Get out of there. Eric ignored him. The Riftborn was still alive, its mangled form twitching as it rose to its feet. Black ichor oozed from the wounds in its head and shoulders, but its eyes, half blinded now, still burned with predatory rage. It wasn't retreating. It was fighting to the death, and Eric intended to oblige. He holstered his rifle and drew his Glock, advancing through the smoke and debris. Every instinct told him to run, but his training, his programming, kept him moving forward. The creature lunged again, but this time Eric was faster. He slid beneath its swiping claws, his enhanced reflexes guiding him with uncanny precision. The moment he cleared its range, Eric rose and emptied the Glock into its mouth. The creature staggered, screeching as the rounds tore through its throat and skull. Eric didn't stop. He reached for a nearby console, grabbed a jagged piece of rebar lying amid the debris, and charged. With a roar of his own, Eric drove the metal spike into the Riftborn's exposed eye. The beast convulsed violently, its claws raking at the floor as it let out a final deafening shriek. Eric leapt back, breathing hard as the creature's body collapsed with a thunderous crash, the ground trembling beneath its weight. The room fell eerily silent. Eric stared at the Riftborn's corpse, chest heaving. It was done. The lab lights flickered, the rift's glow now pulsing wildly. A low hum built into a deafening crescendo, and Eric's radio crackled again. Kessler's voice was strained. 1 minute, Eric. The rift will take everything down with it, including you. Eric looked at the swirling rift, its energy spiraling violently. Debris fell all around him, consoles exploding in bursts of sparks. The air was thick with smoke and ash. He was out of time. Get out of here, Kessler shouted again. Eric turned toward the nearest exit. His enhanced legs carried him faster than should have been possible, his boots pounding against the collapsing floor. He sprinted up the sloping tunnel, the roar of the rift's collapse echoing behind him. The earth shook. The tunnel lights blew out in rapid succession. All Eric could hear was the deafening screech of the rift imploding. He didn't stop running, not yet, not until he was clear. The tunnel shook violently, dust and chunks of stone raining down as the rift's collapse ripped through the facility. Eric sprinted forward, each stride fueled by adrenaline and the sickening hum of destabilizing energy echoing behind him. The light from the lab, once blinding, now flickered erratically, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The air vibrated as if the very walls were screaming. Run faster! The thought wasn't his own, more like instinct. A sharpened directive embedded deep in his engineered reflexes. His boots hit the slope of the tunnel, launching him forward as the ground cracked and splintered behind him. An explosion erupted in the distance. The ceiling groaned. Metal screamed. Eric didn't look back. He could feel the collapse closing in, the tunnel buckling as pressure built. As he ran, his mind flashed to Kessler's words. You're not what you think you are. The truth gnawed at him even now. Was it his programming that pushed him to keep moving, or his will to survive? He didn't know anymore. The tunnel's exit finally came into view, the thick steel blast doors half open, outlined in pale moonlight. Relief surged through him, brief, fleeting, before another explosion rocked the tunnel. A section of the ceiling crumbled, jagged debris slamming into the ground with a deafening crash. Eric barely managed to slide under a falling beam, the heat searing the back of his neck. He dove through the blast doors. Behind him, the tunnel collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. Eric hit the dirt outside, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He rolled instinctively, coming to a stop against the roots of a massive sequoia. A cloud of smoke and dust billowed from the tunnel's entrance, and then silence. Eric lay still for a moment, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. His enhanced lungs pulled in deep, steady breaths, though the weight of exhaustion threatened to crush him. He glanced back at the obliterated entrance. The lab was gone, buried beneath thousands of tons of earth. And the rift? He didn't know. Slowly, Eric pushed himself up onto his knees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the wildlife seemed to be holding its breath. The faint glow of the moon filtered through the canopy, illuminating the clearing like a silver spotlight. It felt like another world entirely, removed from the chaos he'd just escaped. His radio crackled, breaking the silence. The handler's cold voice came through, calm as ever. "Tate, report." Eric didn't answer immediately. He wiped blood and dirt from his face, his rifle still clutched in one hand. The rage simmered low in his chest. Finally, he keyed the radio. "Facility's gone. The rift's sealed." "Understood," the handler replied without a shred of concern. "Return to base for further orders." Eric's lip curled. That was it? Facility's gone and they moved on like nothing happened? Like he hadn't just fought for his life, learned that he was an engineered weapon, and watched the earth swallow the horrors they'd created? He switched off the radio without replying. Eric stood, his muscles protesting with every move, and looked out into the forest. He could still feel the cryptid's presence, lingering at the edge of the shadows. Maybe the rift was gone, but its monsters, the ones that had already gotten through, were still out here. And so was he. Eric adjusted the rifle strap over his shoulder and walked toward the tree line. His enhanced reflexes steadied him, his mind clearing as he accepted the truth. He might be a clone, a weapon, a tool created by the agency, but he was also the only thing standing between those creatures and the rest of the world, and the job wasn't done yet. The forest stretched endlessly before Eric, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The destruction of the lab sat heavily in his chest, but there was no time to process it. The job, his job, wasn't over. He'd sealed the rift, but there was no telling what had already escaped before the collapse. The shadows felt alive, heavier than usual. His rifle was steady in his hands, his every movement silent. For a moment the woods were as they always had been, an ancient, indifferent witness. But Eric knew better now. These trees stood on a battleground, and he was the last man left standing. The radio on his chest crackled, breaking the illusion of calm. "Ranger Tate, this is command." The handler's voice cut through, as detached as ever. "Status update. Your silence is unacceptable." Eric stared at the tree-lined thumb hovering over the radio switch. He could hear their instructions in his mind before they even said them. Return to base, debrief, prepare for redeployment. It was always the same. The agency didn't care what he'd learned, what he'd survived. To them, he was just another asset, replaceable, disposable. Except he wasn't, was he? Eric keyed the radio, his voice cold. "The lab's gone. Rift sealed." "Understood," the handler replied without hesitation. "Return to base immediately. Your presence is required for debrief." Eric's lip curled into a grim smile. "What happens now, Command? You rebuild, open up another lab, send me back into the zone like nothing happened? Your concern is unnecessary, Ranger Tate. Your purpose remains containment. The next mission is already being prepared." The next mission. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Eric's knuckles turned white around his rifle. A spark of rage flared, but beneath it something else stirred. Clarity. "No." The word came out before he could stop it, but it felt right. "Repeat that, Ranger Tate." The handler's voice sharpened. I said no, Eric growled, stepping forward into the clearing, his eyes scanning the dark. You lied to me. You turned me into this, and you didn't even tell me what I was. You keep opening doors you can't close, and every time it's me you send in to clean up your mess. Not anymore. Silence crackled over the line. Finally, the handler spoke again, colder than before. You're compromised, Tate. Return to base immediately. Failure to comply will result in... Eric switched off the radio and ripped it from his chest, letting it fall to the dirt with a hollow thud. For the first time, the silence of the forest felt freeing. He looked at the tree line, where the skewers and other horrors still lurked. They were out there now, scattered and leaderless, but they weren't gone. Eric knew what that meant. The job still fell to him, but this time it was on his terms. You want containment? Eric muttered to the dark, shouldering his rifle. Fine, I'll contain it, my way. Whatever the agency thought he was, a weapon, a clone, a tool, they didn't own him. Not anymore. Eric moved forward into the forest, his steps purposeful. He would finish the fight one creature at a time because it wasn't just his job anymore. It was his choice. The cryptids didn't belong here. Neither did he. But as long as they stayed in Area 12, so would Eric Tate. And this time, no one would get in his way. Eric moved through the silent forest, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the agency's radio abandoned behind him. The woods seemed different now, just as dark, just as dangerous. But the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. For the first time in years, he wasn't taking orders. The fight was still his, but he owned it now. The wind whispered through the towering sequoias, carrying the faint metallic tang of cryptid ichor that still lingered in the air. It was a reminder that the job wasn't done. The collapse of the lab and the rift had bought time, maybe days, maybe weeks, but it hadn't ended the threat. The creatures that had slipped through before the rift sealed were out here, lurking in the shadows, waiting, but so was Eric Tate. He stopped at the crest of a hill, the moonlight spreading across the valley below. The remnants of the rift's energy still clung to the air like a stain, a faint hum vibrating in his chest. He didn't know if the rift was truly gone or if something else would take its place. The agency would rebuild, he knew that much. They'd send new teams, open new labs, and replace him with another weapon when they found one. But until then, the line was his. Eric knelt and pulled out a small handheld GPS, checking the perimeter markers for any breaches. The system hummed faintly, confirming the zone was stable, for now. He scanned the tree line with sharp, practiced eyes, looking for any flicker of movement, any glowing orange eyes staring back at him. Nothing. For the moment, the creatures were still. He leaned back against a thick tree trunk, allowing himself a rare moment to exhale. The memory of Kessler's words lingered in his mind. You're humanity's last line of defense. Maybe that had been the plan when they made him. Maybe the agency thought they could control him forever. But they hadn't accounted for his will, his instincts, his choice. He thought about the rift, the swirling portal that had spewed monsters into the world. He thought about the lab, its twisted experiments and secrets buried now beneath a mountain of rubble. Part of him wished he could forget, pretend that his life had been normal, but he knew better. You're not normal. You never were. Eric accepted that now. Whatever he was, a weapon, a clone, a protector, it didn't matter anymore. He would fight because no one else could, because someone had to hold the line. And that someone was him. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint growl from somewhere deep in the forest. Eric's eyes snapped open, his muscles tensing as he stood and raised his rifle. The cryptids were out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. A grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he moved back into the trees. He didn't need orders, reinforcements, or handlers in his ear. This was his forest now, his battleground. And if the creatures came for him, he would be ready. As the shadows swallowed him, one truth remained. The cryptids would never stop. And neither would he. The line would hold. The wind howled like a living beast, its icy breath tearing through the dense forest. Snow fell in a relentless torrent, blanketing the world in white and obscuring every trail. William's legs burned with every step as he trudged through knee-deep drifts, his rifle slung over one shoulder and his pack weighing heavy on his back. He cursed the storm under his breath. This wasn't the wilderness he was used to. This was chaos, nature's fury unleashed. He almost didn't see the cabin. It loomed out of the blizzard like a mirage, its dark angular frame a sharp contrast against the blinding snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a promise of warmth and shelter. Relief flooded William's chest as he stumbled toward the door, boots crunching over the icy ground. He didn't bother knocking. This was survival, not politeness. Inside, the warmth hit him like a physical force. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The cabin smelled of damp wood and unwashed clothes, and the air was heavy with tension. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him as he entered, their owners frozen mid-conversation. Strangers. "Who the hell are you?" a burly man in a flannel jacket demanded. His voice was gruff, his expression guarded. "Just a hunter," William replied, shaking snow from his coat. "Blizzard caught me out there. Needed somewhere to ride it out." The man didn't lower his guard, but a woman sitting near the fire spoke up. "Let him stay, Gus. The storm's bad enough without tossing someone back into it." Gus grunted but didn't argue. The others introduced themselves. There was Rachel, the reserved hiker who had insisted he stay. Gus, the chatty truck driver. Sam, a grizzled old hermit who spoke in cryptic riddles. And Kyle, a young camper who looked like he didn't belong so far from civilization. The introductions were brief and awkward. Nobody seemed thrilled about the growing crowd, but the blizzard offered no alternative. William found a spot near the fire, his rifle resting within arm's reach. He had learned long ago never to let his guard down in unfamiliar places, especially with unfamiliar people. As the night wore on, the storm outside only grew fiercer. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind's mournful wails seeped through the cracks in the walls. The group tried to make small talk, but the unease in the room was palpable. William watched the others closely, his instincts sharp. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "This storm's not natural," she muttered, staring into the fire. "It feels wrong." Nobody responded, but William noticed the others shift uncomfortably. He gripped his rifle a little tighter. As the firelight flickered and the shadows danced, the storm raged on, and outside, somewhere in the swirling snow, unseen eyes watched the cabin. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth doing little to thaw the chill that had settled in the room. William kept his hands close to the flames, watching the others through hooded eyes. They were an odd group, strangers thrust together by nature's fury, each keeping their own secrets. Gus broke the silence first, pulling a flask from his coat and taking a long swig. "Hell of a night to be stuck in the middle of nowhere," he muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You all just happened to be wandering around out here too, huh?" "I was hiking the back trails," Rachel said, her voice even. "Didn't expect the weather to turn so quickly." Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I was camping a few miles from here. The snow came out of nowhere. I barely made it this far." Sam, the hermit, chuckled softly. "Storms like this don't come out of nowhere," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "They come when the moon calls them." The group fell silent. Gus snorted. "The hell are you talking about, old man?" Sam leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "Full moon tonight," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. "And these woods, they've seen things that don't care much for people." William felt a flicker of irritation at the hermit's theatrics. He wasn't one for ghost stories, especially not now. "You think something out there's causing this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with skepticism. Sam shrugged. "Not think, no." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Kyle looked like he wanted to ask more but thought better of it. Rachel stared into the fire, her face unreadable. Gus just shook his head and took another drink. William stood and moved to the window, peering out into the storm. The snow was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Still, he felt the weight of the storm pressing down on the cabin, as though it wasn't just nature at work, but something more. His breath fogged the glass as he muttered to himself, "Stories don't kill people. Wolves do." "You hunt often?" Rachel asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Enough," William replied, turning back to the room. "You get used to tracking things, staying sharp. Out here, it's the only way to stay alive." "You think something's tracking us?" Kyle's voice wavered, his nervousness almost palpable. William hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet, but you don't want to be caught unprepared if it is." The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words settling over the group. Gus finally set his flask down, muttering about keeping watch. The others murmured their agreement, though no one seemed eager to volunteer. William settled back into his chair, his rifle resting across his lap. Outside, the wind screamed and the storm clawed at the walls. Whatever was out there, storm or beast, he knew they weren't safe. Not yet. The cabin settled into uneasy silence as the storm raged outside, its howls an ever-present reminder of their isolation. The group had divided the night into watches, though nobody seemed eager to take the first shift. Kyle volunteered, his nerves evident as he pulled on his coat and muttered something about getting more firewood. "I won't go far," he said, opening the door just wide enough to slip outside. A gust of icy wind swept in, chilling the cabin instantly. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the rest of them alone in the flickering firelight. William watched the door for a long moment, his rifle resting across his lap. Something about the boy's jittery demeanor gnawed at him, though he couldn't say why. He leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to relax, but his instincts wouldn't let him rest. He'd spent years honing his sense for danger, and now every nerve in his body was telling him to stay alert. Minutes ticked by. The fire popped and the wind howled. Kyle didn't return. "How long's he been out there?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Too long," William said, standing. He moved to the door, grabbing his coat on the way. "I'll check on him." Gus rose, his hand resting on the axe he'd set by the hearth. "I'll go with you." "No need," William replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay here and keep the fire going." Gus scowled but sat back down. William opened the door, stepping out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, the wind biting through his coat as he pulled it tighter. Snow swirled around him, reducing visibility to just a few feet. He called out, "Kyle!" No answer. William followed the faint trail of footprints leading away from the cabin, his rifle at the ready. The snow had already begun to fill them in, and he had to hurry before the storm erased them entirely. The prints led toward the edge of the tree line, then stopped abruptly. Something wasn't right. William scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out faint signs in the snow. A disturbance, a struggle, blood. His stomach tightened as he followed the red-streaked snow to a shallow drift. Kyle's body lay half-buried, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His coat was shredded, deep gashes tearing through the fabric and flesh beneath. The snow around him was soaked crimson. William crouched, his hunter's instincts taking over as he examined the scene. The wounds were unlike anything he'd seen from a wolf or bear. The claw marks were too deep, too precise, and the teeth marks, they were enormous. He rose, his rifle gripped tightly. The storm seemed to close in around him, the wind carrying faint echoes he couldn't place. He took one last look at Kyle's lifeless body before turning back toward the cabin. Inside, the others waited, their faces pale as William stepped through the door. "He's dead," William said, his voice cold. "Something out there killed him." The cabin was silent as William's words hung in the air. The fire's crackle was the only sound, an eerie contrast to the storm's ferocity outside. Gus stood, his face pale but his voice loud and sharp. "What the hell do you mean something killed him? What did you see?" William removed his coat and set his rifle back across his lap. Claw marks, deep ones bigger than any animal I've seen around here. Teeth, too, large enough to tear through bone like it was nothing. Rachel gasped, her hands clasping tightly together. Are you saying it was a bear? William shook his head. Not a bear. Bears don't kill like this. They maul, they rip. This was precise, deliberate. Sam leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the firelight. I told you, he said, his voice gravelly. The moon calls things out here, things that ain't natural. Not this again, Gus snapped, his fists clenched. You don't know that. It could have been a pack of wolves. They get desperate in storms like this. I didn't see wolf tracks, William said evenly. Whatever it was, it's big, strong, and it's close. The room fell into uneasy silence again. Rachel finally spoke, her voice trembling. What do we do? We can't just stay here and wait for it to come after us. William straightened, his tone steady and commanding. We barricade the cabin, make it harder for anything to get in. Gus, take that axe and fortify the door. Rachel, gather anything we can use to cover the windows. Sam, keep the fire going. We'll need the light. What about you? Rachel asked. I'll keep watch, William said, his voice firm. If it comes back, I'll deal with it. The group moved to work, though tension was thick in the air. Gus hammered boards across the doorframe with muttered curses, while Rachel stacked furniture against the windows. Sam threw more wood onto the fire, his movements slow but deliberate. William positioned himself near the main window, his rifle resting on the sill. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the cabin, the snow piling higher by the minute. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the glass, searching for any sign of movement. Hours passed. The fire burned low and exhaustion began to creep in. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and neither did the oppressive sense of being watched. Every gust of wind felt like a prelude to something worse. Rachel sat down near the fire, her face pale and drawn. Do you think it's still out there? William didn't answer immediately. His hunter's instincts told him it was. Predators didn't kill for the sake of it. They killed to eat or to eliminate threats. Whatever had taken Kyle wasn't finished. He could feel it, the same way he could feel a storm coming long before it arrived. It's out there, William said finally, his voice low, and it's watching us. As if on cue, the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin walls. The sound seemed almost alive, filled with malice. William tightened his grip on his rifle. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop, and neither was he. The tension inside the cabin grew heavier with every passing moment. The storm outside howled with unrelenting fury, and even the fire's warmth seemed to falter under the weight of the fear gripping the group. They spoke little, their nerves too raw for conversation. Each creak of the cabin's wooden frame made them flinch. Gus leaned back against the barricaded door, his axe resting against his leg. We can't just sit here all night, he muttered, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. That thing's out there, and we don't even know what it is. We don't need to know what it is, William replied, his voice calm but firm. We just need to survive until morning. And what if it gets in before then? Gus shot back, his tone sharp. It won't, William said, gripping his rifle tightly. Not if we stay vigilant. Despite William's words, the unease in the room was palpable. Rachel sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. Sam was perched on a stool, his eyes closed, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Gus shifted restlessly, his irritation mounting. I'll take the next watch, Gus announced suddenly, standing and grabbing his axe. Might as well make myself useful. William gave him a long look, then nodded. Fine. Stay inside the cabin. Keep an eye on the windows and doors. If you see or hear anything, wake us immediately. Gus nodded and took his position near the front window, the axe resting on his lap. The rest of the group settled into uneasy rest, though no one seemed able to fully relax. William leaned back in his chair, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes never fully closing. The hours dragged on. The wind screamed, rattling the cabin walls, and the fire flickered weakly, casting shifting shadows across the room. Rachel eventually dozed off near the hearth, her breathing shallow and uneasy. Sam remained motionless, his muttering tapering off into silence. When William opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the empty chair by the window. Gus was gone. "Gus?" William called out, his voice sharp. The sound startled Rachel awake, and she sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "He was there a moment ago," she whispered, glancing toward the window. "I swear he was." William was already on his feet, his rifle in hand. The cabin's interior felt suddenly smaller, the shadows deeper. He moved to the window and peered out, but the snow was too thick to see anything beyond a few feet. The storm roared on, drowning out any sound that might have given away Gus's whereabouts. "Stay here," William ordered, his voice low but commanding. "Don't move unless I tell you." He stepped carefully through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. His boots creaked against the wooden floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. He found no sign of Gus, only his axe, abandoned near the back door. The door was ajar, snow blowing in through the narrow gap. William's stomach tightened as he approached it, his rifle raised. The snow outside was disturbed, faint tracks leading away from the cabin and into the storm. Rachel appeared behind him, her voice trembling. "Do you think it got him?" William didn't answer immediately. His hunter's instincts were screaming at him, warning him that something was wrong, something more than the storm, more than the tracks in the snow. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice grim, "but I intend to find out." William stared into the swirling snow outside the cabin, his mind racing. The storm obscured everything beyond a few feet, and the tracks leading away from the cabin were already beginning to vanish under the relentless snowfall. Gus's disappearance left a knot of tension in William's chest. Something was out there, something intelligent, patient, and deadly. Rachel hovered behind him, her fear palpable. "You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" William shook his head, shutting the door and locking it tight. "Not in this storm. It'd be suicide. Whatever took Gus, it'll come back." Rachel shivered, though whether from fear or the cold, William couldn't tell. She returned to the fire, stoking it to chase away the chill creeping into the cabin. Sam remained in his corner, his lips moving silently in prayer, his eyes fixed on the floor. William resumed his position near the window, his rifle resting on the sill. The storm outside was an unrelenting wall of white, but he forced himself to focus, scanning for any movement. His hunter's instincts were on high alert, every sense sharpened by years of tracking dangerous prey. Hours crawled by. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The wind howled, its mournful wail almost sounding like a voice. William ignored it, his eyes never leaving the window. Then, out of the corner of his vision, he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes. They hovered just beyond the edge of visibility, large and unblinking, reflecting the faint light from the cabin. William froze, his breath catching in his throat. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, locked onto the cabin with an unnatural intensity. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She looked up, her face pale in the firelight. "Get behind me, now." She obeyed without question, creeping closer to the wall as William adjusted his grip on the rifle. He sighted down the barrel, his heart pounding in his chest. The eyes were still there, watching, and then they moved. The figure shifted, stepping closer to the cabin, its shape emerging faintly from the storm. It was massive, its hulking frame distorted by the falling snow. William could make out the faintest hints of fur and the glint of sharp teeth as the thing crept closer, its movements slow and deliberate. William didn't wait. He fired, the rifle's crack shattering the silence and reverberating through the cabin. The flash from the muzzle lit up the room, and Rachel let out a stifled scream. When William lowered the rifle, the eyes were gone. "Did you get it?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I don't think so," William said, his tone grim. "It moved before I fired." He kept his rifle trained on the window, his body tense and ready. The storm outside raged on, and the cabin walls seemed to press in closer. Whatever was out there was smart, cunning, and it wasn't finished with them yet. "Stay close to the fire," he told Rachel, "and keep your eyes open." Rachel nodded, her expression one of barely contained terror. William stayed by the window, his grip on the rifle tight, his gaze fixed on the storm. He knew this wasn't over, far from it. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, its warmth suffocating under the weight of fear. The glowing eyes were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow over everyone inside. The storm outside roared, relentless and unyielding, as if the world itself were trying to bury them. Rachel huddled near the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. Sam remained in his corner, staring blankly at the floorboards, his prayers having tapered into an unsettling silence. William stayed near the window, his rifle at the ready, scanning the storm for any sign of movement. The silence inside was broken by a creak, a sound too deliberate to be the storm. William turned sharply, his eyes darting toward the back of the cabin. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. William held up a hand to silence her. He moved slowly toward the sound, his boots barely making a noise on the wooden floor. The firelight flickered, casting jagged shadows as he approached the corner where Sam sat. "Sam," William said quietly. The old man didn't respond. William's grip tightened on his rifle as he stepped closer. Sam's head was bowed, his long, stringy hair obscuring his face. His shoulders rose and fell in shallow, rhythmic breaths. "Sam," William repeated, louder this time. The old man finally looked up, and William froze. Sam's face was pale, almost waxy, his eyes wide and unfocused. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It's here." Before William could respond, a loud crash came from the roof, followed by the sound of scraping claws. Rachel screamed, jumping to her feet. William spun, his rifle aimed at the ceiling. "Get to the center of the room," William barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Rachel obeyed, but Sam didn't move. He stared at the ceiling, his lips moving in silent prayer as the sounds above grew louder. Something heavy shifted across the roof, its weight causing the rafters to groan. William kept his rifle trained upward, his heart pounding in his chest. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so profound it seemed to press against his ears. He held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then the back door slammed open. Snow and wind burst into the cabin, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into near darkness. Rachel screamed again, scrambling toward William as he turned to face the open doorway. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he could just make out the shape of something retreating into the storm. "Close the door," William shouted. Rachel moved to obey, but her trembling hands fumbled with the latch. William rushed over, slamming the door shut and securing it with a heavy wooden bar. The howling wind outside seemed louder now, more insistent. Sam's voice broke the tense silence. "It's toying with us," he said, his tone flat. "It knows we're afraid." William didn't respond. His mind was racing, calculating their next move. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It was something far worse, and it was hunting them. "We're not leaving this cabin," William said, his voice resolute. "Not until the storm passes, and if it comes back, we'll be ready." But deep down, he wasn't sure they would be. The cabin was plunged into tense silence once more, save for the howling storm outside and the faint groan of the roof beam straining under the weight of snow. William stood near the door, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. The fire had died, leaving only faint embers, and the cold crept into the room like a predator of its own. Rachel huddled in the center of the cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Sam remained by the wall, his muttering growing louder, more frantic. His words were incoherent, a mix of prayer and gibberish that only heightened the oppressive atmosphere. William's voice cut through the tension. "We need light." He gestured toward the fireplace. "Rachel, see if you can get it going again." Rachel nodded shakily and moved to the hearth, fumbling with the logs and embers. Her hands trembled as she worked, and William couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He was their only defense, their only chance of survival. The scratching returned. This time it came from the walls. Long, deliberate scrapes that sent chills racing down William's spine. He spun toward the sound, his rifle raised. The noise moved, circling the cabin, a predator testing its prey. Rachel froze, her eyes wide with terror as the scratching grew louder. "It's trying to get in," she whispered, barely audible. William moved toward the sound, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He followed the noise, his rifle trained on the walls, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. His senses were razor-sharp, his hunter's instincts screaming that danger was imminent. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Then Sam laughed. It was a low, guttural sound, completely out of place and utterly unnerving. William turned to find the old man staring at him, his lips curled into a twisted grin. "What's so funny?" William asked, his voice cold and steady. Sam's laughter faded, and he shook his head. "You don't see it, do you? You don't know what you are." William frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What are you talking about?" Sam didn't answer. Instead, his eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, his body limp. Rachel gasped, rushing toward him, but William stopped her with a sharp motion. "Stay back," he ordered. Before he could inspect Sam, the door exploded inward. Snow and wind roared into the cabin, and with it came the creature. It was massive, its hulking frame filling the doorway. Its fur was matted with blood and snow, its glowing eyes locked onto William with an intelligence that sent a shiver through him. Its jaws were lined with jagged teeth, its claws glinting in the dim light. William didn't hesitate. He fired, the crack of the rifle deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, and it let out a guttural roar, recoiling but not retreating. It lunged forward, its claws swiping through the air. William dove to the side, rolling to his feet and firing again. The second shot hit its chest, but the beast barely flinched. It turned its attention to Rachel, who was frozen in terror near the hearth. "No!" William shouted, drawing his sidearm. He fired rapidly, the gunshots echoing like thunder, driving the creature back toward the doorway. It snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing before it retreated into the storm once more. The door slammed shut behind it, leaving the cabin eerily silent. Rachel collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. William stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his rifle still trained on the door. The creature was gone, for now, but William knew it would return. The cabin felt hollow in the aftermath of the attack. Snow swirled through the open door before Rachel, trembling and pale, managed to close and latch it. She slumped against the frame, her breaths shallow and ragged. The fire had died completely, leaving the room dimly lit by the faint glow of the storm seeping through cracks in the walls. William stood motionless, his rifle still trained on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He replayed the encounter in his mind, every movement, every detail of the creature. His shots had landed true, but the beast's resilience was unnatural, its intelligence unsettling. Rachel's sobs broke the silence. "We're going to die here," she whispered, her voice cracked and uneven. "No, we're not," William said firmly, though the doubt clawed at him. "We just need to hold out until morning." Sam's lifeless form caught William's attention. The old man hadn't moved since his strange outburst. William crouched beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Sam?" No response. The old man's skin was cold, his breathing shallow. William pulled back his collar and froze. There on Sam's neck were deep, jagged claw marks, hidden beneath layers of grime and old clothing. Blood seeped from the fresh wounds, staining his shirt. "He's been marked," William said grimly, standing and turning to Rachel. "It must have happened when the creature came through the door." Rachel's wide eyes locked on the old man. "Is he infected? Can he turn into one of those things?" "I don't know," William admitted, "but we can't risk it." Sam stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. "You don't understand," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "It's not me you should fear." "What are you talking about?" William demanded, leaning closer. "What do you know?" Sam's lips trembled, his breath shallow. "The storm, the beast, it's drawn to one of us." William narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, one of us?" "You," Sam whispered, his gaze locking onto William's. "You brought it here." The words hit William like a blow. He recoiled, staring at the old man as Rachel's fearful gaze turned to him. "That's impossible," William said, his voice firm. "I've been tracking it, fighting it. I'm not—" His voice trailed off as fragments of memory surfaced, the missing time between watches, the brief blackouts he'd attributed to exhaustion, the strange primal connection he felt to the beast. His stomach turned as the truth clawed its way into his consciousness. "No," William whispered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "That's not possible." Sam gave a weak laugh, his head lolling to the side. "You'll see. When the moon is at its highest, you'll see." Rachel stepped back, her hands trembling as she reached for the fire poker. "William, is it true? Are you one of them?" "I don't know," William said, his voice barely audible, but deep down he feared he did. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the howling wind outside. William stood frozen, his rifle hanging loosely in his hands. Rachel kept her distance, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. Her eyes darted between William and Sam's lifeless form, her terror barely contained. "I don't remember," William said, his voice low and uneven. "I've been blacking out. It doesn't make sense." Rachel took a step back, her knuckles white against the iron poker. "It makes too much sense, William. You're connected to it, aren't you? That's why it keeps coming back." He wanted to deny it, to argue, but the pieces were falling into place, fitting together in ways he couldn't ignore. He had been bitten sometime during his hunt. Lost and dazed, he had wandered into the cabin, bringing the beast with him. Now, as the full moon blazed in the sky, he could feel its loud hum. He was going to turn into that thing, the blackouts. Had he killed Gus? He turned away from Rachel, his heart pounding. "I didn't know," William murmured, his voice barely audible. "I swear, I didn't know." Rachel's voice wavered. "What happens now?" William didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he moved to the cabin's small desk, where a stack of yellowed paper sat beside a worn fountain pen. He dropped into the creaking chair and began to write, his hands trembling as he put the night into words. Each sentence was a confession, a chronicle of his growing realization. "I came here as a hunter. I thought I was tracking a beast. I thought I was protecting the others. I was wrong." He glanced at Rachel, who watched him warily from the far side of the room. She didn't look at him like a person anymore. "The beast isn't just stalking us. It's a part of me. I can feel it now, stirring beneath my skin, waiting for the moon to call it forward. I thought I was the solution. I've been the problem all along." His pen hesitated as the storm outside seemed to wail louder, almost celebratory. He could feel the pull of the moon now, a magnetic force that made his blood boil and his senses sharpen. His reflection in the frost-coated window caught his eye. His pupils were too wide, his teeth too sharp. "I need you to leave," William said suddenly, his voice startling Rachel. "What?" she stammered, gripping the poker tighter. "Take whatever you can carry. Get out of here. I'll stay. I'll keep it here." He looked up at her, his expression filled with a mix of determination and guilt. "It's the only way you'll survive." Rachel hesitated, then moved toward the door, her movements quick but cautious. She paused, her hand on the latch, and looked back at him. "What will you do?" William glanced at the journal. "I'll finish this. Someone needs to know what happened here." She didn't say anything else. The door opened and the storm swallowed her. William hoped she would survive. William returned to the journal, his hand steady now as he wrote his final words. "If you find this, know that I stayed. Know that I fought, but also know that when the moon rises, this cabin and this whole area is not safe. You might run into something like me." As the moonlight broke through the cracks in the walls, William set the pen down. His body began to tremble, the transformation starting. He closed his eyes and let the beast take over. The next morning, the cabin was empty, the snow stained with blood. And on the desk, the journal remained, waiting for the next traveler to find it.